In a world far, far away, where spirits lived within everything around, there was a guy who could talk to them. Because of that gift, he ended up joining a group of 5 heroes who fought together and defeated the Demon King. His name was Universe. From above, the kingdom of Foolish looked absolutely breathtaking. At its heart stood a grand castle, not just a stunning piece of architecture, but also a proud symbol of the kingdom's glory. The dark-haired guy, clearly surprised, waved his hands around while asking what was going on. He wanted to know why his teammates were acting so strangely. The fierce hero who once slayed the Demon King stared him down with a cold, hard look. Behind that hero stood the rest of the team, each one having played a big role in that brutal battle. A tall, intimidating man in heavy armor spoke up in a deep, serious tone, saying Universe wasn't really part of their group, he was just some guy in charge of magical tools. A young blonde girl, fixing her freshly painted lips, backed him up, saying Universe barely talked to anyone during their travels and always kept to himself. Another woman joined in, saying Universe acted like he was better than everyone just because of his strange power. Her glare looked even harsher than the night's. Universe stood frozen, completely shocked by what he was hearing. Nervously, he stammered, trying to explain that he didn't mean to seem distant, he just wasn't good at talking to people, but always tried his best to help. The hero smirked wickedly and said he couldn't even understand what Universe was mumbling. His eyes were full of arrogance and clear hatred toward him. Universe couldn't believe this was happening. Their words kept coming like knives. They mocked him, asking what good he ever did for the team since he never did anything special. Completely confused, Universe asked, "What about my magical horse? The one with the spirit inside?" The hero just rolled his eyes, revealing his cruel intentions. The blonde man raised his chin confidently and strode toward the horse standing nearby. With a grin, he spread his arms and said anyone could handle such a simple tool. Then, without hesitation, he kicked the magical horse as hard as he could, calling it a useless hunk of metal. Universe was stunned. He never thought his own teammates would act like this. He ran to his creation, shouting its name, Trans, begging them to stop. He turned toward the supposed savior of the world, pleading for the mockery to end. Without realizing it, he grabbed the arm of a woman dressed like a nun, desperate for her help. She looked down at his hand with disgust, then without a moment's hesitation, swung her fist straight into his groin. Universe gasped in agony. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees. The pain was unbearable, sharp and endless. The woman glared at him and hissed that she'd warned him not to touch her. She hated being touched by people she didn't like. Her face twisted with fury and disgust. Barely able to move, Universe reached out toward Trans, who was lying under the blonde hero's boot, and asked weakly if his companion was okay. The hero sneered coldly and said Universe cared more about his junk than about his own team. His tone dripped with contempt, and then a wicked grin spread across his face as a nasty idea hit him. He lifted his head, looked down at Universe, and said arrogantly, "Don't worry, we'll fix you up too, just like this piece of trash." Universe woke up late in the evening, lying bruised and beaten on a pile of garbage, torn bags, broken boards, old buckets, and random junk scattered around him. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw were the dark rain clouds slowly spreading across the sky. Even the weather seemed to hate him that day. He covered his face with his hand, feeling a mix of frustration and anger build up inside. Deep down, he just wanted to cry like a child. He thought about how everyone in the hero squad had an important future ahead of them. The hero would become the next king and marry the princess. The warrior would lead the army. The priestess would rise to sainthood, and the young sorceress would become a wise sage. And him? Universe didn't even know what he was supposed to become. Sometime later, he ended up working in the Department of Magical Research and Maintenance. His focus was on repairing magical devices, especially his favorite project, the Magic Horse. His workspace was cluttered with books, flasks, tools, and glowing solutions, each used for something different. Gently patting Trans on the side, he smiled and said he had finally fixed him. Soon, Trans would be running like new again. The other workers nearby turned to look, confused as to why Universe was talking to a machine. He later walked down the long corridor, lost in thought, barely noticing the people passing him. He held a folder of papers tightly to his chest as if it contained something precious. Then something on the wall caught his eye, a notice board filled with various announcements. But right in the middle, a massive poster showed the white-haired hero who had humiliated him not long ago. Universe gave a faint smile, pretending it didn't bother him, but inside, it stung. Then he suddenly thought of Typhon. He wondered how she was doing. He remembered hearing that she was getting married soon. He decided he'd visit her later if he had a little time to spare. Just as he continued walking, someone called out his name. One of his co-workers told him that Godwin, his boss, wanted to see him. When Universe entered the office, Godwin didn't even look up from the paper he was reading. Without lifting his eyes, he said flatly that Universe was fired. Universe froze, his whole body going stiff, as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. Shock hit him hard. He hadn't expected this at all. Stammering, he asked why Godwin made that decision. The boss finally turned toward him, leaning back in his chair with an annoyed sigh. He said Universe was disgusting, talking to devices like they were alive. Trying to explain himself, Universe nervously said that the magical devices had spirits inside them. But Godwin didn't care. He cut him off, asking why he couldn't speak properly or at least raise his voice. The boss said he was tired of hearing his mumbling, and that his co-workers had complained about how unfriendly he was. Universe tried to defend himself, explaining that his work mattered to him, but Godwin didn't stop interrupting. Instead, he told him that the engraved name Universe on all his magical devices would be removed and replaced with Godwin's own name. After all, customers loved those devices, and Godwin was enjoying the praise for work he hadn't done. The man smirked and said he'd soon become an official thanks to Universe's talent. Then, with fake politeness, he muttered a sarcastic, "Thank you for all the work," and waved him off. Outside, the sun was shining brightly. Children laughed and played in the streets while adults bustled around, some enjoying the day, others lost in their daily rush. But none of that joy reached Universe. He walked slowly, his head down, feeling empty. He let out a long sigh, thinking about where he could possibly find a new job, something that matched his skills and what little hope he had left. Then, as he passed a busy street, he overheard two girls chatting excitedly about the princess, the spirit of the wind, marrying the hero who defeated the Demon King. The words hit him like a sudden memory. He remembered what he'd thought earlier. He had completely forgotten about Typhon's wedding. The ceremony was being held outdoors under the perfect weather. The whole kingdom had gathered, lining up just to catch a glimpse of the hero and the Wind Princess as they began their new life together. The square sat high on a hill, far less crowded than the streets below. Only the most important guests were allowed there. In the center stood a beautifully decorated arch and a silver bell that glimmered under the sunlight. The wind spirit, the bride, looked a little lost, and though she smiled faintly, it was clear she was struggling to hold back her sadness. Universe pulled a dark cloak over his shoulders, trying to blend in with the crowd. He stood still, watching the ceremony quietly. When his eyes met the bride, his heart softened. Typhona looked stunning in her wedding gown, radiant and graceful. He smiled faintly, genuinely wishing her happiness, even if that happiness no longer included him. The woman from the hero squad, the one who always wore a scarf around her head, spoke loudly to the guests, announcing that the princess, the spirit of the wind, was about to marry the hero who had saved the world. Universe forced himself to stay calm, pushing down the uneasy feelings rising inside him. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept swirling, restless and heavy. He had always believed that spirits were kind beings, pure, gentle, and filled with joy whenever they could help humans. Serving humans was an honor for them. But he also believed something else, that humans should never treat spirits like tools or slaves, no matter how powerful they were. The princess looked more and more troubled as the ceremony went on. Her eyes lowered, refusing to meet her fiancé's gaze. The crowd noticed her unease, but they simply assumed she was nervous after all. Marrying the country's hero would make anyone anxious. Then suddenly, something in the crowd caught her attention. Typhon turned her head and smiled at the guests, waving softly to ease the tension. Her expression brightened for a moment, and it almost seemed like she felt more warmth toward the people watching her than toward the man standing beside her. Then her smile faded. She froze. Her expression shifted to pure shock, as if she had just seen something impossible. Universe blinked, confused by the sudden change in her face. And then maybe it was his imagination. It felt like their eyes met. The princess leaned forward slightly, squinting toward the crowd as if trying to confirm what she was seeing. Her breath caught. She couldn't believe it. But yes, it was him. Universe's heart started racing. When he realized she was looking right at him, warmth flooded through his chest. He smiled shyly and lifted his hand, giving her a small, uncertain wave. Then, out of nowhere, a powerful gust of wind swept across the hill. Guests stumbled backward. Dresses and banners flew wildly, and even the hero himself was blown off balance. The air roared as something charged forward with unstoppable force. It was her, the Wind Princess. She dashed straight toward Universe, running as if through the air itself, completely ignoring the chaos around her. People froze, speechless, unable to process what they were witnessing. Universe's stomach dropped. The realization hit him. The princess, the spirit of the wind, was flying straight at him. His cloak didn't help. There was no hiding now. Tears streamed down Typhon's cheeks, carried away by the strong wind the moment they fell. Her face flushed pink with emotion, but her eyes were locked on him, full of disbelief and longing. Before he could even react, she reached him. He instinctively spread his arms, and in the next second, she leapt into them, crashing against his chest with such force that he almost fell. He barely managed to stay on his feet as she clung to him tightly, her body trembling with relief and joy. Powerful waves of wind burst out around them, knocking people off their feet and sending petals and decorations swirling through the air. The storm mirrored her emotions, wild, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Still crying, she looked up at him and whispered, her voice trembling, "If it's really you, then why are you alive?" Universe stared at her, completely lost. He had no idea what she meant, or what the hero had told her. Through tears, the princess explained that the hero, her soon-to-be husband, had said, Universe disappeared during the campaign. She had believed he was dead all this time. Meanwhile, the hero lay sprawled on the ground, stunned and humiliated by the sudden chaos. Typhon held on to Universe, her emotions bursting out uncontrollably. "If you're alive," she said between sobs, "then there's no reason for me to marry anyone else." The wind howled around them, stronger and stronger, as if the storm itself was echoing the turmoil inside her heart. The young man had noticed it too. The strong gusts of wind were so powerful they blew away everything in sight. Not just light decorations and bushes, but even the guards. Everyone around had stared at each other, confused and unable to understand what was going on. The princess had gently taken Universe's hand and told him that none of this really mattered. Then, lifting his hands, she had looked into his eyes with hope and asked if he wanted to run away with her, to leave everything behind and start an amazing adventure filled with freedom and new possibilities. Before he could answer, the wind spirit had already made her decision. Filled with determination, she had grabbed the young man and pulled him aside. There had been no time to think. The guards were already chasing after them. Typhon, without hesitation, had lifted Universe into her arms and rushed away from the wedding. Universe, still in shock, had clutched the princess's shoulders tightly, unable to process what had just happened. His face had shown complete confusion, while the guests, including the hero of that world, sat frozen, trying to understand the chaos around them. Petals had still been floating through the air as the groom glared at the scene. Anger had twisted his face. His eyes had widened, veins showing like cracks. He had clenched his jaw and wanted to scream, and soon he did. Consumed by rage and despair, he had shouted insults at Universe. Then, turning to the guests, he had ordered them to catch the eared girl and the man with her. The spirits around had been horrified. How could he say such things? One of the spirits, unable to bear it, had let out a piercing cry, calling out to the fleeing hero by name. Braban had turned in confusion, not sure what was expected of him, but the spirit had said he couldn't stay silent after hearing what the young man had said about his bride. Meanwhile, when Universe and Typhon had reached the city, they had suddenly run into Braban's wedding carriage. Universe had frozen for a moment, noticing the sign on the roof of the vehicle. But when Typhon had pointed toward the horse pulling the carriage, Universe had immediately recognized it. It was his old creation, his magical horse, Trance. While Typhon had climbed into the carriage, Universe had gently petted the horse. The princess had asked in surprise how he knew it, and he had explained that Trance was the first magical device he had ever built. Trance had fought alongside him and his team from the beginning, all the way until their victory over the Demon King. The girl had looked amazed, but had noticed something strange, an engraving with another name. The inscription had stated that this device was created by Gatsuan, the former head of Universe. The young man had grown furious. How could that be? It had still been his creation, but the false credit had only made him angrier. Before he could say more, Typhon had pulled him toward the cart and told him to get in quickly. They had climbed into the carriage and continued their escape, doing their best to get as far away as possible. Even though the horse was magical, it had moved like an ordinary one, its hooves clicking against the ground just like any normal steed. Universe had wondered why Trance wasn't speaking. Maybe someone had removed his voice module. He had quietly promised his old friend that he would fix him someday and erase that awful engraving. Behind them, knights on horseback had been closing in fast, almost on their heels. When the guards began surrounding the carriage, Typhon had called out to Universe, but he had already noticed the danger. Frustrated and anxious, Typhon had shouted that they'd be caught any second at this rate. Universe couldn't understand why Trance was built with the best parts he'd ever made. His speed should have been unmatched. Then it had hit him. Trance's power came from the spirits of the earth, and since Typhon was the spirit of wind, the elements had clashed. The earth spirits couldn't fully cooperate while she was around. When Universe had looked at her, she had met his gaze and said softly that she understood everything. They hadn't had much time to think. One of the guards on a horse-drawn carriage had already caught up to the princess. Typhon had noticed it and sent out a fierce gust of wind, so powerful it spun like a mini tornado, sweeping away everything in its path. The guard hadn't stood a chance. His carriage flipped over as he screamed in shock. Typhon had quickly tossed the reins toward Universe, and he had barely managed to catch them. Instead of trying to control the horse from the seat like anyone else might have, Universe had leapt straight onto its back. Pressing close against the horse, he had praised his old friend for holding on so well. Then he had quietly called out to the spirits of the earth living inside the horse, asking them to help him just one more time. Moments later, faint voices had echoed from deep within the horse, warm, familiar voices that answered his call. The earth spirits, tiny gnome-like beings, had appeared with joy, running up to him, cheering and complaining all at once about how exhausted they were from carrying him around so often. But seeing their master again had filled them with renewed energy. They had promised to show him their true strength, and in the next instant, they vanished back inside the horse. Suddenly, the horse had burst forward with incredible speed, faster than ever before. Dust clouds had swirled behind them as the carriage rattled wildly, the wind roaring in their ears. Typhon had clung to her seat, shouting excitedly to Universe that they were going way too fast. Ahead, more guards had appeared, blocking the road with their carriages, but Trance hadn't slowed down. The magical horse had charged straight through, crashing into their carts with such force that soldiers and horses alike had been thrown into the air before tumbling to the ground. The blast of power had even lifted Typhon's carriage off the road, and for a brief moment, Universe himself had been airborne too. When they landed, the wheels had hit the ground hard, but they kept racing forward. Typhon and Universe had held on tightly, barely managing to stay in place. Typhon, thrilled by the rush, had thrown her hands into the air, laughing and shouting in excitement. She had called out that it was amazing, more thrilling than anything she had ever felt, and had urged Trance to go even faster. In the heat of the moment, she had accidentally pressed a button without realizing it. Suddenly, the big wedding sign of Princess and Braban had risen high above the carriage, and a loud boom had followed as streams of flower petals shot into the air, showering over them like a magical rain. Typhon and Universe had both looked up in wonder, mesmerized by the sight. But the surprises hadn't stopped there. Small, decorative devices tied with ribbons had fallen from the carriage, hitting the ground and releasing soft, melodic sounds as they bounced. The whole scene had turned dreamlike. The wind spirit riding on the wedding carriage seat, Universe on the horse, petals swirling around them, music echoing through the streets. People nearby had stopped in their tracks, staring in awe at the dazzling sight rushing past. Even those who hadn't noticed at first had turned toward the melody filling the air. Murmurs had spread through the crowd as they realized it was the hero's wedding carriage, but what shocked them even more was that the man on the horse wasn't the hero at all, but some unknown young man. The crowd had stood frozen, watching as the carriage sped down the street like something out of a legend. Typhon didn't care at all. She felt as happy as a little kid, finding the whole thing hilarious. But the people around weren't so lucky. Their curiosity got them into trouble. As the carriage rushed forward at full speed, powerful gusts of wind followed, sweeping some of them right off their feet. Typhon kept laughing and glowing with joy, spreading warmth and light around her. The Universe just smiled softly in return, clearly pleased to see her that happy. Suddenly, the earth spirits began adjusting something on the wedding sign that hung in an elegant carved frame. The Universe noticed and watched curiously to see what they were doing. When the spirits finished, they proudly showed their work. The sign now read that this was the love carriage of the Universe and his friends. One of the earth spirits, standing tall and confident, confronted Braban face to face. With a firm, commanding tone, he demanded an explanation for the cruel words Braban had spoken earlier. He even repeated the insult to make sure he had heard it right, his voice full of disbelief that anyone could say such a thing. He glared at Braban and warned him that insulting their princess, the spirit of the wind, was unacceptable even for someone as great as him. It was simply unforgivable. Braban frowned in irritation, clicking his tongue in annoyance. He hated being lectured like that and clearly thought the whole situation was ridiculous. To him, these spirits weren't even people, and he certainly didn't respect them. He turned away and muttered that instead of wasting time, they should focus on capturing the creature and the universe as soon as possible. But the wind spirit wasn't done. He asked again, pressing Braban to clarify who exactly they were trying to capture if not the universe himself. Braban's expression turned sour. He was clearly annoyed that the spirit wouldn't drop it. Then the spirit asked, "Didn't you say the universe was dead?" Braban froze and didn't even turn to face him. He just stood there silently, then half-turned with a mocking smirk and rolled his eyes, mimicking the spirit in a childish way. The spirit ignored him completely and ran off to tell the others that the universe was alive. Braban crossed his arms, raised his chin arrogantly, and scoffed, wondering out loud why everyone was making such a fuss over these so-called non-humans. In his mind, anyone disgusting in this world was called the universe. The very name itself disgusted him. The spirits immediately turned toward Braban, their faces filled with shock and anger. Their eyes burned with emotion, and they rushed at him, shouting, "How dare he insult their dear friend?" Braban hadn't expected such a reaction. He stepped back, holding his hands up defensively, trying to talk his way out of it. But the wind spirit, furious and full of fire, shouted that Typhon had only agreed to marry Braban because they'd been told it was the dying wish of the universe. Now it seemed they had been deceived all along. He vowed to uncover the truth and said they would never trust the so-called hero again. Braban clenched his jaw, furious and confused about why everyone cared so much about this universe. The spirits left the square, warning him that if the universe really was alive, he'd better prepare for the worst. Braban stood there alone, staring after them in disbelief. Meanwhile, Typhon and the universe managed to escape into the forest. The guy leaned forward, catching his breath, while Typhon jumped cheerfully down from the carriage. The earth spirits, overcome with emotion, started to cry. They were overjoyed to see their master alive after thinking he'd died. The universe gently patted one of them on the head and thanked them for their help. Typhon, touched by the sight, smiled warmly, feeling completely content. The girl glanced suspiciously at how the young man gently stroked the earth spirits. It almost seemed like she wanted that same kind of attention but didn't have the courage to say it. The guy seemed to pick up on the look in her eyes and placed his hand on her head, thanking the spirit of the wind as he did. The princess smiled brightly, and her unusual ears twitched with pure joy. The universe smiled too, but after a moment, he asked if she was really sure about running away from the wedding. She puffed up her cheeks and turned away, saying she had already made up her mind. Besides, she hadn't run away with just anyone, she'd run away with the universe himself. If only he knew how lost she had felt when she first heard about his disappearance. Lowering her head, her cheeks flushed red as she nervously admitted that she loved him. Her words came out shaky, but she still managed to say them. The universe, almost as if he didn't completely grasp the weight of what she'd said, smiled and replied that he loved her too. The princess's face turned crimson, and she screamed in surprise at his answer. The earth spirits looked at the boy awkwardly, as if waiting to hear the same words from him. Realizing what they wanted, the universe chuckled and confessed his love to them as well. Typhon frowned, her cheeks puffing again. She called him an idiot, blushing furiously, then raised her fist as if she was about to hit him. The universe threw up his hands, completely confused and trying to defend himself. But before he could react, she suddenly grabbed him by the collar and pulled him closer. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she said how truly happy she was that he was still alive. With gentle eyes, the universe let her hold him close, feeling the warmth and trust in that moment. He thanked her sincerely, once again. When Typhon finally calmed down and sat on a nearby stump, he asked what they should do next. She admitted she didn't really know, and asked what he had in mind. He said he wanted to fix Trans first since he was in bad shape. Running his hand over the horse's engraving, the universe explained that to erase it, they'd need to travel to the land of the water spirits Kung Kanto Veret. The mark had been made by powerful fire spirits, so only an equally strong water spirit could remove it. Typhon jumped excitedly, saying she wanted to go with him. He asked again if she was sure she didn't want to return home, but she replied that since the wind spirits were everywhere, her homeland would easily find out where she was anyway. Stepping closer, she asked softly if he was really willing to take her along. He smiled and said he honestly didn't know how he could ever say no to her. Overjoyed, the princess raised her fist high and shouted that it was settled their adventure had officially begun, and their first destination would be the land of the water spirits. Contaware? Elsewhere, a man wearing gloves flipped through some papers, his face twisted in irritation. When he saw something he didn't like, he crumpled the sheet in anger. It was Braban. He let out a cold, bitter laugh, muttering to himself that he'd catch the universe and his bride, and make them lick his boots. Maybe humiliation had driven him mad, or maybe he'd always been like that. Typhon bent slightly and gave a sweet smile, her expression full of kindness. She thanked the earth spirits warmly, saying how happy she was to meet them. The spirits, however, looked nervous and uneasy at being directly addressed by the Wind Princess herself. Their hands trembled, but they still managed to offer a shy greeting. The universe gently reassured them, then turned to Typhon and explained that if she was truly going with him, she'd have to learn to get along with spirits of all elements. Pointing ahead with a serious look, he said that this was his one condition. Typhon didn't hesitate for a second. She nodded firmly, saying she agreed and that everything would be fine. Then, together, they set off on their journey. Universe told her not to rush so much, which made the girl stare at him in surprise, not understanding why he wanted to delay their departure this time. He explained that she should probably change her clothes first in her wedding dress. She'd stand out too much and attract unwanted attention. Typhon agreed instantly and dashed into the carriage to change, too excited to waste even a second. From outside, the guy stood frozen, listening to all the noise coming from inside. It sounded like she was tearing the whole carriage apart while changing. He sighed, wondering what else needed to be done before they could finally set off. But then, he heard her calling his name loudly. When he turned, Typhon had already changed and was proudly showing off her new outfit. She winked playfully and smiled wide, clearly waiting for him to say something nice. But the first thing that caught his eye was the familiar magic bracelet on her wrist. He asked if she was still wearing the same one he thought she was. Typhon glanced at it and nodded, saying, of course she was. He was the one who had given it to her. That made him smile warmly, but it looked like she was still a bit nervous about something. Folding her hands in front of her, she asked again, a little shyly, what he thought of her look. She clearly wanted to hear something sweet from him. Universe told her she looked beautiful and that the outfit suited her perfectly. Her face lit up immediately, her earlier nervousness fading away. She admitted that she'd been a little anxious since it was the first time she'd worn something like that. The guy chuckled softly and agreed he'd never seen her in such a style before. The princess looked away, her cheeks slightly pink, and said she hoped he'd get to see every side of her personality during this journey. Then she quickly changed the topic, waving her hand toward the carriage and asking if he wanted to change too, since there were plenty of other clothes inside. Universe thought for a moment, then followed her into the carriage, and what he saw left him stunned. The inside was nothing like the outside. The space was massive, almost like stepping into another world. Instead of a small interior, there was an enormous room. No, a whole palace. He blinked in disbelief, wondering why the hero had needed so many rooms, as if he had planned to honeymoon with a dozen princesses at once. Typhon called him over to another room, a huge, lavish bedroom. She walked confidently to the wardrobe and threw it open. It was packed full of extravagant clothes and accessories, each one more luxurious than the last. Her eyes sparkled as she turned to him, clearly excited, and asked what he thought of the outfits. But the guy didn't seem impressed. With a blank expression, he said they should just leave it at that and move on. The two stepped back outside and started discussing how the inside of the carriage was perfect, but the outside definitely needed work, maybe reinforcing or covering it somehow. The question was, where would they get the materials? Universe quickly realized that they were surrounded by trees. Typhon immediately agreed, saying the forest spirits would surely help them. She pounded her chest confidently and insisted on handling it herself, since wind spirits got along well with forest spirits. Grabbing a sturdy axe, she marched toward the nearby trees full of determination, intending to ask them for assistance. But things clearly didn't go as planned. After a short talk with the forest spirits, Typhon trudged back toward him, holding the axe loosely and looking downcast. When she reached him, she said softly that it wouldn't work, the spirits would be hurt, and they shouldn't force it. Her disappointment was written all over her face. Universe walked past her toward the trees, determined to try talking to the spirits himself. Maybe he could find another way. He stopped in front of the nearest tree, studying it carefully while a soft breeze rustled through the leaves around him. He smiled and lifted his gaze toward the tall tree, its branches stretching proudly to the sky. With respect, he greeted the forest spirits, hoping they'd answer him with their voices and blessing. A faint whisper echoed from within the tree. Several soft voices spoke. Realizing who he was, they believed it was Mr. Universe himself. Curious, the young man asked how they knew his name. The spirits replied that there wasn't a single tree in the entire land that didn't know him. All trees were connected through their roots, they explained. And through those roots, they shared every bit of important news. One of the forest spirits even appeared upon a branch as it spoke. Universe nodded and respectfully made his request. He apologized for the disturbance and explained that he needed wood but didn't want to harm them in any way. The spirit spread its branch-like arms wide in delight and said with surprise that the stories about him were true. He really was different. Most people, it said, would never bother to ask permission. They'd simply cut down trees without a second thought. Universe thought to himself that maybe ordinary people couldn't see these spirits at all. The forest spirit continued, saying that those who become wood are proud to serve people. Our wood is strong and durable, it said. We are glad to help and to live on through what we become. When they began chopping, the axe glided through the wood effortlessly, almost like slicing through paper. Together, Universe and Typhon placed the logs on the stump and worked in rhythm. She swung the axe boldly while he held the wood steady. With help from the earth spirits, they turned the logs into planks and used them to repair the carriage's outer frame. When the job was finally done, everyone cheered in excitement, exchanging high fives. They were proud of their work, and Universe voiced what they all felt, that the result was excellent. Typhon jumped with joy, raising her fist high, clearly the happiest of them all, though perhaps just more expressive than the rest. As they admired their finished work, Universe noticed something odd, a set of shackles fastened to a wooden post at the carriage's corner. He frowned and asked Typhon what they were. Her cheerful expression faded instantly. She lifted her head with visible disgust and explained that these shackles were once used on spirits who served humans. If a spirit made a mistake, they were chained with this device to reflect and repent. Universe's face darkened. He said it was horrible that anyone, even a so-called hero, could think such a cruel thing was right. Typhon watched him closely, listening to his every word, and then smiled softly, clearly pleased by his reaction. It was exactly what she'd hoped to hear. But Universe looked puzzled at her giggle. Had he said something odd? The princess quickly explained that in this world, most people treated spirits as lesser beings, worthless, even disposable. But she was happy, deeply happy, that he wasn't like that. He smiled faintly and said that to him, all life was precious, no matter the class or form it took. The princess added that even the forest spirits could feel his kindness, and she admired him for it. Her gaze was full of warmth and sincerity as she told him how grateful she was for his respect toward every spirit he met. Her words and her gentle smile made Universe blush slightly. He turned away awkwardly and suggested that they should get moving. Typhon beamed with excitement and cheerfully called out to Trans to lead the way. If their magical horse had been in perfect condition, the journey might have taken less than a day. But now, after everything it had been through, it would take them at least 3. Universe mentioned that was only if nothing unexpected happened along the road. Yet, as he spoke those words, someone in armor was already standing near the carriage. These were the royal knights sent by Brabin to bring back his fiancée and old comrade. The soldiers quickly spotted the carriage and sent word to their commander about where it was headed. Typhon sensed that something was wrong and glanced at Universe, who had already noticed it too. Just as they were about to reach the border, the carriage suddenly came to a halt. Knights of the kingdom surrounded them from all sides, blocking every possible escape. Both of them instantly understood there was no turning back. They'd have to fight their way through. Universe looked at his horse, Trans, and said firmly, "I'm counting on you, buddy." Then he called out to the earth spirits, asking for their strength too. They responded with excitement, their voices echoing around the forest. "We'll help you. Don't worry." The carriage sped forward once again, wheels thundering across the ground. The sun blazed behind them as the knights on horseback closed in fast. The gap between them shrank until the guards were only a few meters away. "Hold on tight," Universe shouted, leaning forward. Typhon did the same, her eyes sharp with determination. With a deafening crash, they broke through the knights' line, smashing aside everything in their way. Wind whipped around them as Typhon climbed up onto the roof, her hair fluttering wildly. She stretched out her arms and released several fierce gusts of wind toward the pursuers, pushing them back and buying more time. Sliding back down, she grinned and shouted, "Nice job, Universe. Trans, faster. We're almost there." But just as she said that, Universe narrowed his eyes. Something ahead caught his attention. Right at the border stood a massive barrier, a wall of spears and rocks tightly bound together, completely blocking the way. The sharp stakes pointed outward like fangs, and if they tried to ram through, Trans would be seriously hurt. Typhon's expression turned grim. "We can't go through that," she said worriedly. "Trans won't make it." Universe clenched his fists, thinking fast. Then an idea struck him. He turned to her and shouted over the roar of the wind, "Typhon, can you use your wind powers to lift the carriage over it?" Her eyes widened. "What? That's impossible. I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted firmly. "I believe in you. Just try, please." His tone was so sincere that her cheeks flushed red. She bit her lip and nodded. "All right, I'll try. But no promises." She cupped her hands around her mouth and screamed into the sky, calling out to the other wind spirits, "Everyone, please, lend me your strength." Within moments, tiny glowing orbs appeared all around them, dozens, then hundreds darting through the air like fireflies, drawn to her voice. The light around the carriage shimmered with their presence. Typhon extended her hands, catching some of the tiny lights in her palms. Her voice trembled with emotion as she turned to Universe. "It's not enough," she said, tears threatening to fall. "I can't lift something this big." But Universe didn't back down. "Then we'll call all of them," he said, raising his hand high. "If any wind spirit wants to have fun, come to me." He focused his energy, summoning one of his spirit tamer abilities, Gathering. A brilliant glow flared from his fingertip, and his voice carried across the plains like a heartbeat. The call was pure, full of desperation and courage, echoing for hundreds of meters. The surrounding air trembled with power. For a moment, there was silence. Then one of the wind spirits whispered to the others, "He's calling us. Universe is calling us." And one by one, they began to answer. Then dozens, maybe even hundreds of spirits gathered in one place, all asking the same thing: was it really the universe calling them? Typhon and her companion looked up in awe, watching the tiny lights float through the air, drawn to his call. But the next moment, the wind spirits didn't just circle around the boy's finger, they also surrounded the startled princess. The young man hadn't expected so many to respond, and once he remembered why he'd summoned them, he quickly asked Typhon to continue. Feeling a bit hurt and sulky, she puffed out her cheeks, trying to hide her emotions, but eventually agreed. She turned to the spirits floating around them and asked for help lifting the cart they were on. They needed to move fast. The wind spirits stretched out in every direction, circling the carriage and forming a shimmering, magical mist. The air around them felt alive, filled with a sense of freedom and wonder. Both of them, full of determination and excitement, braced themselves as the carriage slowly rose from the ground. The wheels lifted as if pulled by invisible hands, powered by the mysterious strength of the wind spirits. In a flash, the whole carriage took off into the air. The obstacle ahead no longer mattered. Nothing could stop them now. The soldiers chasing them stared upward in shock. None of them had ever seen anything like it, an entire carriage flying right above their heads. As it soared over the border, the knights shouted in disbelief and even a bit of awe. Typhon admired the breathtaking view, while Universe smiled, noting that they had finally escaped the chase. Just then, he suddenly froze, as if something strange flickered before his eyes and stirred his heart. A feeling he couldn't explain made him pause, unsure if it was coincidence or fate. Typhon gently covered his hand with hers. He looked at her, confused, and asked why she did that. The princess blushed, stammering for an excuse before blurting out that it was dangerous up here and she didn't want him to fall. Her cheeks turned red as she looked away. He chuckled softly and said he was grateful, then tightened his grip around her hand. Typhon's heart swelled with joy, her smile bright and childlike, like someone who'd just received a long-awaited gift. She couldn't stop smiling. Her whole face glowed with happiness. Universe kept his eyes forward, proud and calm, while Typhon simply enjoyed the warmth of the moment. She cared less about flying now. What mattered was that he was holding her hand. With no roads in the sky, endless space stretched before them, full of freedom and possibility. Their carriage, like a magical ship, glided through the air, leaving the kingdom and its troubles far behind. Meanwhile, inside the grand palace, important discussions were taking place, ones that could shape the future of the entire nation. In a lavish hall filled with luxury and tension, a meeting was underway about the kidnapping of Princess Typhon. The hero and soon-to-be king clenched his fists in anger, demanding to know why his bride and her kidnapper were still free. Gatswan, the Minister of Magic, stepped forward and assured him that there was no need to panic, soldier. equipped with his latest inventions, were stationed at the border. They just needed to wait. Braden exhaled, but his frustration still showed on his face. Then a soldier rushed in, saluted, and announced that the princess's carriage with Typhon and Universe inside had already crossed the border. The fugitives were now far beyond the kingdom's reach. Gatswan jumped up from his chair, completely shocked by the news. He slammed his hand on the table, unable to control his emotions, and demanded to know how that could even be possible. The knight nervously explained that the carriage had simply flown across the sky, easily bypassing all the new equipment and soldiers stationed at the border. The Minister of Magic refused to believe him. He scowled and said there was no need to tell fairy tales carriages couldn't fly. He even asked if the knight had been bewitched to start spouting nonsense, but the knight firmly denied it. The future king slammed his fist on the table and growled that Gatswan clearly didn't understand a thing. Braban immediately realized that Typhon must have used the power of wind magic to lift the carriage into the air. Gatswan covered his mouth in disbelief, and after a brief pause, he stammered out a weak attempt to sound like he understood. Still trying to save face, he placed a hand on his chest and reminded everyone that the magical horse attached to that carriage was his own creation. Braban snapped back that Gatswan was completely useless if he let them escape, and asked what he planned to do now. After a long, awkward silence, Gatswan admitted that he didn't really have a plan, he just wanted to remind everyone how impressive the horse was. Braban's expression twisted in frustration before he suddenly laughed and said they needed to get serious about the search. Gatswan, desperate to please him, suggested spreading wanted posters across the entire world. That way, everyone would be hunting for Universe dead or alive, and eventually, Braban would get what he wanted, Typhon back by his side. Braban slammed his hand on the table again, making Gatswan flinch, sure he was about to be punished for his idea. But instead, the king's expression brightened, and he praised the plan enthusiastically, calling it brilliant. Gatswan sighed in relief, his nerves finally settling. He had wanted approval so badly that he was shaking while proposing it. Soon, they began printing the wanted posters, and Braban promised himself he would never again be humiliated the way he had been when Typhon escaped with Universe. Arms crossed, he convinced himself that the matter would be resolved soon, and grinned, though his grin looked more wicked than confident. The next day, the streets were buzzing with people going about their day. Braban rode through the city in his carriage, eager to see how citizens would react to the new posters. People gathered around the announcements, whispering and pointing, but something was wrong. Next to Gatswan's official poster, there was another one. The crowd stared at both in confusion. One claimed that Typhon and Universe were fugitives wanted for kidnapping, but the other showed a cheerful image of Typhon standing beside her friend, smiling. The captions didn't match either one, called Universe a criminal, while the other suggested the princess had willingly gone with him. Braban's eyes widened in horror. He hadn't expected this. Someone had publicly made a mockery of him. People on the streets began murmuring, unsure which version to believe. Many concluded that the princess hadn't been kidnapped at all, she had simply left on her own with Universe. Braban's jaw tightened. Rage boiled inside him, but the townsfolk kept talking. Some men laughed openly, saying it was embarrassing that a king couldn't even keep hold of his bride. A few joked that even they could have done better. The women nearby tried to hide their giggles, but soon burst out laughing too. Furious, Braban screamed at them, demanding how they dared insult their future king. Red-faced and trembling with anger, he rushed back to the palace. He stormed into his office, throwing open the door and shouting for Gatswan. But instead of his minister, he found a room filled with spirits, allies of Typhon and Universe. The moment they saw him, they surrounded him, waving the same posters that hung all over the city, demanding answers. The spirits surrounded Braban, their voices sharp and angry. They said it was now obvious how he handled things from the very beginning. He had known that their friend, Universe, was alive. They demanded an explanation for the words written on the wanted posters, alive or not. How could he say such a thing about someone still living? Their anger grew, calling him what he truly was, not a hero, but a liar. The portrait of Princess Typhon that he had commissioned suddenly felt worthless to them. They warned that the Spirit King would be furious once he learned the truth. Without trust, their alliance with Typhon's people would collapse. And then, what would Braban do? Boiling with anger, Braban pointed his finger at them and shouted insults, saying they were overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. Then, completely losing his composure, he threw his arms wide and declared that Universe was nothing but a shameless fool, and burst into laughter. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He ranted that if he wanted, he could destroy the entire Spirit Nation in an instant. wiping them all out and throwing their remains into a single grave. The spirits, deeply offended and disappointed, exchanged glances and left in silence, leaving him alone in the room. Brayban let out a long sigh and rolled his eyes. He thought that maybe he should have done that from the start. It would have saved him from all those annoying arguments. He wandered through the long corridors of the castle until he reached a large, dark chamber. Inside, a man wearing a heavy crown sat in the center, the king himself. The moment Brayban stepped in, the king coldly announced that he had just received a letter from the spirit realm. Their alliance had officially been dissolved. Brayban froze. He hadn't expected such quick retaliation. The king's tone grew harsher as he demanded an explanation. Brayban stuttered, trying to justify himself, saying it was all a result of the arrogance of their ministers and the disobedience of the spirits. But before he could finish, the king cut him off with one sharp word that silenced him completely. Brayban stood still, like a scolded child, staring at his father in confusion. The king's voice echoed through the hall as he said that since the demon lord had been defeated, every nation now recognized their power. The only thing left was to make the spirit nations kneel before them, then their kingdom would rise as an empire ruling over the world. Losing this chance, he said, was unacceptable. Then, with no hesitation, the king declared he was calling off the engagement to the spirit king's daughter. Brayban stared at him, speechless, trying to think of something that could calm his father, but it was too late. The king clenched his fist and shouted that if his son disagreed, he should go and fix the broken alliance himself, and then, in fury, he threw Brayban out of the chamber. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Brayban standing in the hall, dazed and humiliated. He stared at the floor, wondering how things had gone so wrong, and why his own father had called him useless and pathetic. Outside, he found himself surrounded by spirits again, the same ones who had left earlier. Their expressions were filled with disgust and disappointment. They didn't even want to look at him. Feeling crushed, Brayban bowed deeply, lowering his head and body as a gesture of respect and remorse. He muttered an apology, saying he was truly sorry for his harsh words. His lips trembled as he bit them, trying not to let his anger show. Deep down, all he could think about was how he couldn't let that pathetic universe take Princess Typhon away from him. The spirits chuckled coldly. One of them stepped forward and said that they wanted to hear a real apology. Brayban slowly lifted his head, his anger rising again, but he quickly forced himself to calm down. With a crooked smile, he said proudly that they had no right to demand sincerity from him when they themselves didn't even have the decency to bow their heads. They demanded sincerity, but they hadn't even shown a scrap of respect. The spirits didn't like that at all and immediately started talking about stripping him of his hero title. They said he needed to apologize to more than just them. Brayban was barely holding himself together. Veins stood out on his face and he kept biting his lip. Inside, he wondered if they saw anything in him other than trash, but he didn't dare voice it. With shaking hands, he lowered himself to the floor to make the formal apology the spirit ministers expected. Lying face first, he swore he would bring Universe back home. He apologized from the heart and begged them not to break the alliance. The spirit leader told him he was wrong. He didn't owe an apology to them, but to Universe and Princess Typhon. Being told to apologize to the two people who'd caused his humiliation made him furious. He lifted his head and said he'd apologize when he got back home, because if he did it now, no one would listen and it would be pointless. One spirit argued that apologizing right away made sense, and there was a way to make sure his words reached them, but mostly, they needed to be sure he actually meant it. Grinding his teeth, Brayban thought they were mocking him. How could he apologize to those scum? It felt like an intolerable humiliation. He convinced himself they weren't really there and that his words couldn't reach Typhon and Universe. Then, voice tight, he asked the question that mattered most. If he apologized, would they keep the alliance? The proud spirit minister assured him that unlike Brayban, they always kept their word. Sinking a little from the effort to control his temper, the young man forced out that he was wrong and that he wouldn't force Typhon into anything anymore. If she'd made a mistake, he wouldn't blame her. He begged them to bring her back. The spirits froze, surprised by what he revealed about his relationship with the princess, details they hadn't known. Realizing he'd said too much, he bit his lips so hard blood sprang out, but he didn't even notice. He kept talking, asking for Universe's return, admitting he'd treated him badly, and calling him back to service. For effect, he added that he'd fire Gatswan and make that minister into a scapegoat. This was the first real emotional apology he'd ever given. He was shaking. The strain made tiny blood vessels around his eyes burst and red streaks ran down his face. While he tried to maintain a smile, The spirits clustered around a strange device and commented that it worked perfectly. Desperate, Brayban pointed at the gadget and demanded to know what it was. A spirit explained it was a magical device that would transmit everything spoken directly to universe. Unlike static pictures, it could record movement and sound. At that moment, a recording of Brayban's apology began to play from the device itself. The spirits started leaving, planning to have a journalist friend spread the recording far and wide. Alone and stunned, Brayban suddenly jumped up like a wild animal, growling and lunging at the departing spirits. He grabbed the minister who'd held the device and shouted that he would destroy it if that recording spread. His reputation would be ruined. The spirits looked at him with contempt, took the device, and shook their heads at his behavior. Brayban raved that they'd set him up. The spirits said the alliance had been restored and walked away. He begged them, desperately, to delete the shameful recording. When they turned and left for good, he collapsed onto his back like a spoiled child. He flailed his arms and legs on the floor and wailed that they had to stop it and erase everything immediately. The carriage carrying the runaways rolled across the land of Awampu. Typhon's eyes lit up as she spotted a pond ahead and shouted with excitement. She hopped up and down like a child, pointing it out to Universe. Her pure joy made him smile. He told her that Awampu was famous for its many ponds and lakes, and it even had the largest lake in the world so big it looked like a sea. Hearing that, Typhon's excitement grew even more, and she said she wanted to see it no matter what. Universe thought about it and realized she had never been to another country before. Since she was a princess of the wind spirits, she'd always been sheltered. He said that even though it wasn't exactly on their route, they'd stop by and take a look. Typhon beamed and thanked both him and Trance, who was driving the carriage. When they finally arrived, they saw a huge poster that attracted tourists, and behind it stretched a massive, breathtaking lake. Typhon eagerly ran toward it. On the shore, people were dancing, drinking, laughing, and cooking dinner. Music and laughter filled the warm air. Typhon was amazed by how lively everything was. People in swimsuits walked past them, and the path to the lake shimmered under the lights. Universe, however, didn't share her enthusiasm. He just wanted to leave, but seeing her so happy, he stayed quiet. Typhon reached out her hand and urged him to come along and enjoy the evening with her. Just as they were about to head deeper into the crowd, a deep voice called out to them from behind. They turned around to see a man wearing a hat and sunglasses, smoking a cigar. He told them to stop right there. The man introduced himself as Loquat, the one in charge of the lake. Holding up 2 fingers, he said the entrance fee was 10,000 enda per person, which included a barbecue set and a few extras, so 20,000 enda for both of them. Universe and Typhon froze. That price was ridiculous. When Universe asked why it was so expensive, Loquat smirked and said that this was the hero's price. Universe immediately remembered that any service connected to heroes was always overpriced, like those posters of Brayban plastered everywhere. Loquat looked him up and down and asked if he didn't even have 20,000 enda. Getting no answer, he sighed and said there was another way. He could cut the price in half if they had a girl in a swimsuit with them, and if she was pretty and stylish, he'd even throw in a free gift. Typhon's eyes sparkled mischievously. She asked Universe to wait and ran back to the carriage. Loquat and Universe stood awkwardly in silence until she returned a moment later, slightly out of breath and shyly apologizing for the delay. When Universe saw her, his mouth went dry. She had changed into a swimsuit. Her outfit fit her perfectly, and even Loquat's jaw dropped. With tears of joy, he gave her 2 thumbs up and said they could enter for free. Typhon proudly walked past him, humming a tune to herself, while Universe followed behind, feeling awkward. As soon as they stepped onto the beach, every man turned his head toward Typhon. None of them even noticed Universe. They surrounded her, throwing questions one after another, asking if she was alone, where she came from, if she wanted to hang out with them. One guy even joked that spirits liked to serve people and asked what she enjoyed most. Before Universe could react, Typhon broke free from the crowd and wrapped her arms around him, declaring that he was the only one she served. Universe froze in shock, his face turning red. He looked away, thinking that her words were a bit too bold even for her. Then he noticed, surprised, and a bit shocked, how all those guys suddenly looked at him with clear annoyance before scattering along the beach. Typhon happily clung to Universe's arm, pressing herself against him as tightly as she could, pleased with what she'd just said to everyone. The guy let out a relieved sigh, realizing that one problem was now off their list, and suggested they keep moving. The girl, clearly satisfied, smiled and agreed. She put on a cute face and suggested that, since they'd finally made it there, They should walk around and enjoy the scenery. The young man caught a glimpse of the same group still gossiping about them and pointing rudely, but he decided to ignore it and went along with her. They strolled at an easy pace toward the lake. When they reached the shore, Typhon was genuinely amazed. It was the first time she had ever seen such a stunning view. She mentioned that the air by the water felt cooler, but still really pleasant. Universe laughed and told her not to press so hard against him or she might get her clothes dirty. He explained that he was still wearing his work outfit and that it smelled like oil, but the princess didn't care. She said it was fine proof of how hard-working he was with the spirits. Feeling proud of herself, she decided to lean even closer, and he awkwardly called her name in embarrassment. Suddenly, a loud rumble from her stomach broke the moment. Typhon blushed and looked away, clearly embarrassed. Universe just chuckled and said her stomach was right, they hadn't eaten since morning. Since they were already there, he suggested getting some barbecue. Typhon's eyes lit up and she eagerly agreed, her face showing pure anticipation for something tasty. They soon reached the area with barbecue tables and grabbed a set of ingredients that included all sorts of things. Typhon cheerfully announced that she had already prepped everything while Universe worked on lighting the grill. Once the coals started glowing, he said the grill was ready and began laying out the food. The smell of sizzling meat quickly filled the air, so delicious that people at nearby tables couldn't help but look over. Juicy pieces of meat, fish, and shrimp sizzled on the grill, their juices dripping onto the coals and creating that irresistible smoky aroma. The nearby group clearly wanted to taste it but held back out of pride. When the food was done, Universe handed Typhon a portion and warned her to be careful, it was still very hot. She thanked him, took a small piece with her fork, and blew on it as steam rose from the surface. The meat was tender and juicy, perfectly cooked. She took a bite, and her face instantly lit up. A warm blush spread across her cheeks as she chewed slowly, savoring every moment. When she finished, she looked completely delighted and exclaimed that it was absolutely delicious. Her eyes sparkled, and she even jumped up to tell Universe that it was the best thing she had ever eaten. The guy laughed, a bit flustered, and said she was exaggerating. Still smiling, he handed her another serving and told her to try more. Typhon looked surprised at what was on her plate next: big, juicy shrimp. She tasted one and couldn't help but admire how plump and flavorful it was. Then she moved on to the shellfish, enjoying its soft texture, and finally said with a satisfied grin that it was a real treat. She even licked the tip of her fork, completely lost in the taste. People around them watched the scene, clearly tempted by the smell and the girl's reaction. Universe noticed and thought to himself that the others just didn't have enough fire to make barbecue this good. The guy kept grilling the seafood, repeating to himself that it had to cook over the heat of the coals, not the open flame. But that wasn't the main thing on his mind. Universe quietly said that thanks to the spirits of fire and forest, they were making the best barbecue in the world, and he thanked them for their help. He stepped aside, and the spirits replied that he was the one who deserved thanks. The spirit of fire spoke up first, complaining that people always thought they could create fire on their own. She said she'd had enough of that ignorance and asked the spirit of the forest if she agreed. The forest spirit gently nodded, saying she did, and that it would be wonderful to make barbecue again with Mr. Universe. The fire spirit laughed and agreed, saying it wouldn't be the same without him. Universe thought for a moment and said that by combining the powers of different spirits, one could strengthen them and even discover new abilities. He pointed to the spirits of fire and forest as a good example. They brought warmth and delicious food when working together. Then he added that not all spirits got along, and forcing them to cooperate was a bad idea. It was always better to ask and persuade rather than command. He remembered how he'd once used his spirit tamer powers to help reconcile quarreling spirits, and since then, they'd become inseparable friends. Typhon suddenly called out to him and told him to open his mouth. When he did, she grinned and fed him a piece of food with her fork, saying that since he'd cooked everything, she should be the one to feed him. She asked how it tasted, and Universe nodded while chewing. It was delicious, but somehow different. Looking up at the sky, he thought that the mosin from this lake tasted better than any steak he'd ever had. When he turned his head, he noticed a poster showing a man in a raincoat holding a huge fish, surrounded by people. Above it was a chart listing fish weights. First place was 70 kilos. He smirked, thinking the man looked a lot like him. Typhon, still holding her plate and fork, called out his name, and he responded with a smile, saying he was going to prepare a real mosin for her this time. The girl froze for a moment, confused, and asked if the one they just ate wasn't real. Universe chuckled and said it was, but there was something even better swimming in this lake. A group of guys nearby overheard and laughed mockingly. One of them asked if Universe actually planned to catch a fish himself, warning that a Mosin could kill a man with one bite. They started joking that he just wanted to show off to impress his companion. Then they began betting on how he'd die. One said he'd drown, the other said he'd get bitten. They even agreed that whoever guessed right would get Typhon. The girl glared at them furiously, but Universe said nothing. He simply walked to the edge of the lake, crouched down, and looked into the water. He greeted the spirit softly, saying it had been a long time since they'd last met. Then he asked if he could borrow a Mosin again, just like before. The surface of the water rippled in response, and soon the round outline of a smiling face appeared. It was the spirit of the lake. He greeted Universe warmly and confirmed that he'd heard the boy's call. The spirit said he'd prepared a fine Mosin for him but warned that the creature was dangerous and Universe should keep a safe distance. Then he added that all the boy had to do was snap his fingers and the Mosin would appear. Universe nodded and said he understood. He stepped back from the lake as people nearby shouted, asking if he'd already given up. Without answering, he snapped his fingers with a calm, confident smile. The water started to bubble, then churn violently. Waves spun in a circle, spraying droplets everywhere. Suddenly, a massive fish burst out of the lake with a thunderous splash. Universe didn't flinch, he simply watched, pleased with the result. Typhon gasped in delight at the sight of their new meal, while the group of guys stood frozen, shocked by what they had just witnessed. The Mosin, huge, nearly the size of a man and a half, splashed onto the shore in front of Universe. Gasps and murmurs rose from behind him as people pointed and shouted, wondering how he had managed to summon such a giant fish with just a snap of his fingers. Some mocked his weird way of fishing, but Universe didn't even glance back. In his mind, he quietly answered that it wasn't just fishing, it was done with the help of spirits. Typhon clasped her hands over her chest, her eyes shining with admiration as she told him how amazing he was. While Universe grabbed the fish by the tail, she jumped around excitedly beside him. Soon, a group of girls in swimsuits ran up, circling the two of them and giggling. They flirted with Universe, praising him and saying that anyone who could catch such a massive Mosin couldn't possibly be a bad guy. Typhon looked at them with open disgust, clearly annoyed by their behavior. The other guys checked the fish's weight and gasped when they saw it hit hundreds of kilos. They started calling Universe a real hero, pretending they'd believed in him all along. He saw right through their fake smiles and empty words, staring at them coldly. Still, the guys grinned and suggested that he share the catch with them. Before Universe could answer, they grabbed a knife and started dragging the Mosin away. Typhon immediately yelled for them to stop. Pointing at them furiously, she demanded to know who gave them permission to touch her fish. When one of the guys nervously said the carcass was too big for two people and that everyone should eat together, Typhon refused outright. She glared at them and reminded them how they had mocked Universe before the catch. Her sharp voice made the boys freeze. They averted their eyes, ashamed. One by one, they dropped to their knees and begged for forgiveness, promising they wouldn't behave like that again. Typhon wasn't impressed. She crossed her arms and said their apology didn't sound sincere, ordering them to bow lower and do it in sync this time. The boys obeyed, and she still frowned, saying they wouldn't see a single bite of the Mosin until their apology was perfect. Universe couldn't help but chuckle quietly, watching her command them like a teacher scolding children. He wondered where she'd even learned to talk like that. Later, a new poster appeared on the beach. It showed Universe and Typhon proudly posing with their 100-kilogram Mosin, now a local legend. Universe was preparing a horse-drawn carriage for the next leg of their journey and called out to Typhon to get ready. She smiled and agreed. Just as they were about to leave, the crowd from the beach ran up, waving and shouting their goodbyes. They thanked the pair for the Mosin, saying they would pass down the story of Mr. Universe for generations. The heroes smiled, waving back as the sun began to set behind them. As the carriage rolled along, Universe quietly thought about how he'd only given the people the fish's skin. Typhon pouted and said that maybe it was because she was human and they didn't like her much. He chuckled, remembering how people loved eating crispy fish skin, and said that their Mosin had broken every record. He'd even stored the rest in a magical freezer. Typhon lifted her arms and said how amazing it all was, laughing that she'd never felt this happy before. Universe looked down at her with a soft smile and said he was glad they'd stopped there. She smiled back, resting her head on his shoulder and closing her eyes. She quietly thanked him for everything. He told her it was time to rest, mentioning there was a bed inside the carriage. As the sun sank lower, Universe noted that people were probably searching for them. If they stayed too long on the road, someone might mistake them for thieves or even think he'd stolen a hero card. Typhon looked up at him in surprise, but then smiled and said that wherever she was, she felt safe as long as she was with him. Without taking his eyes off the path, Universe said they should stop soon, maybe in a field. After a moment, he changed his mind and said there was a village nearby, one he remembered passing through back when he fought in the demon-slaying squad. Typhon pumped her fist in the air, thrilled that was exactly where she wanted to go. The road wound through quiet houses and a lone path up into the forest toward the well. When they reached Iden, people milled about the houses, statues stood here and there, and a poster showed a man who called himself a hero alongside a girl. They walked through the little town, surprised by how many people were around. He asked if they'd really arrived, and she smiled about the crowd. They stopped at a statue and inspected it. Typhon asked if it was supposed to be a hero, and he said it looked like one. Her smile died when she saw the statue. It showed a hero's foot on someone's face, and the plaque read, "Great Hero" and "Blockhead Universe." Typhon rushed over, upset, saying it was awful and that Universe wasn't like that. He closed his eyes and tried to calm her, saying it must be some silly misunderstanding. He pointed ahead and suggested they move on, but she puffed out her cheeks in annoyance and turned away. A villager with a bucket brushed past her and apologized, and she waved it off, saying it was nothing. As the man walked away, he muttered something about the well. Typhon glanced down, distracted. Somewhere in the village, a man who fancied himself a hero was making a show of it, boasting that such a glorious hero should appear. Typhon spotted him and froze. Horrified, she ducked behind Universe. Universe frowned at the crowd where the self-styled hero stood and stepped forward to address them. People turned to look, and an old woman with a cane and a headscarf recognized him. She pointed the cane at him and asked the crowd if they remembered. "That idiot, Universe," he stammered, confused, and admitted it was him. The old woman grinned with teeth, so few you could count them on one hand, then scowled and accused him of angering Mistress Iden, the spirit. She said word of his exploits had spread, and now, with the well acting up, the village was in a bad mood. He asked if they could stay the night, but the old woman snapped at him. She said Lady Iden had been sulking and the well was close to drying up, and if they let criminal Universe stay, the village might be ruined. She warned she'd arrange a meeting between Universe and Lady Iden so the spirit would be placated and would drive him off. He hesitated, knowing a meeting could lead to a big misunderstanding. Typhon peered around, thinking this might not be the hero she'd hoped for, and grabbed onto his cloak as hopes of another hero vanished. The bragging man was the exact type she disliked. The boastful hero strutted closer to the villagers, thinking up a plan. The crowd spoke up, saying Universe had helped them before and wasn't really the villain he'd been made out to be. The show-off suggested that if Universe were handed over to Lady Iden as a kind of offering, cooked or baked as she pleased, maybe the spirit would calm down. He even joked that after that he'd toss Universe into the stable like a rag. The old woman then told Universe he could stay the night, but only if he first met with Lady Iden. A group of people climbed the mountain, their lanterns swinging in the dim light. The man with the lantern led the way. The so-called hero followed behind, and two others carried the village chief between them. Universe and Typhon walked last. Typhon glanced at Universe and asked if they were really going to meet her. Universe turned his head and smiled faintly. She frowned, saying she didn't trust those villagers. He chuckled softly and told her not to think like that Iden was just a spirit, and they were only there because he hadn't cleared up a small misunderstanding. Typhon looked at him, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. The old woman at the front shone her lantern ahead and announced that they had arrived. Before them stood an old well surrounded by worn statues and faded posters showing a hero carrying a girl in his arms. The place felt eerie. The well gave off low, unsettling sounds that made the villagers freeze where they stood. The old woman gave Universe a shove toward the well, telling him to get on with it. He stared into the dark opening with a tense expression, saying nothing. Typhon watched him quietly. A sudden loud groan came from below, and Universe froze. The others gasped and stepped back. A black, clawed hand burst out of the well, followed by a head covered in long, wet hair. A girl-like figure crawled out, her face hidden except for one glaring eye full of rage. She reached toward them, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her hair flew as she opened her mouth in a twisted scream. People panicked and scattered. The dark-haired girl lunged straight for the hero. He barely turned before she slammed him onto his back. He shrieked and begged for help as she struck at him again and again. The old woman trembled and shouted for Lady Iden to stop that she was attacking the hero, not the one she wanted. Then, pointing at Universe, she cried out that the blockhead was right there. The ghostly lady froze mid-motion and turned slowly, whispering Universe's name with a crooked grin. The hero had already passed out. As she finished saying his name, her smile twisted into something sharp and delighted. Universe and Typhon stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The spirit suddenly floated toward them. Typhon grabbed Universe's arm in fear, but then Lady Aiden's expression changed entirely. Her face softened into a sweet smile. She lifted her hands and greeted him warmly, calling him gentleman and saying, "Welcome back." She threw herself into his arms, hugging him tightly. Typhon just stood there, stunned, her mouth open. The villagers stared in complete silence, too shocked to speak. Then the story shifted to the past, to what had really happened. Long ago, a group of heroes had come to that same village, seeking the power of the well's spirit to help them defeat the demon lord. Among them was the hero's servant, Universe. But things went wrong. Universe had accidentally poured poison into the well. Lady Aiden, the spirit, had been furious. Yet when she saw the hero, her anger faded. Out of love, she swore eternal loyalty to him. Back in the present, Lady Aiden looked at Universe and smiled. Then her tone changed. With playful affection, she leapt toward him again. Typhon gasped and tried to step in, but stopped when she realized the spirit wasn't attacking. She was embracing him lovingly. Lady Aiden now looked like a young girl, her short hair framing her face, small, gill-like ears peeking out. She wore a light kimono tied with a bow and spoke about herself in the third person, saying she couldn't believe they had met again and that she was overjoyed. The hero, now conscious again, hiccuped in disbelief at the scene. Lady Aiden beamed at Universe, saying she had never forgotten him and had thought of him every single night. Typhon clenched her fists and shouted, asking how the spirit dared to hug him like that. The villagers just stared in confusion. The old woman trembled, asking if Lady Aiden didn't hate Universe. Lady Aiden turned to her calmly and said, "That was wrong, she adored him." The old woman stammered that the hero had told her otherwise. Lady Aiden's smile turned firm as she replied that she would now tell everyone the truth about what had really happened. The hero's group of 4 stopped beside the old well. The so-called hero leaned forward and shouted into it, demanding the spirit to show herself because the great hero had arrived. Nothing happened. The well stayed silent. The hero's grin faded, replaced by irritation. The girl wearing a scarf handed him a small vial of poison. Nearby, Universe, the quiet 5th member of the team who usually carried their supplies, watched uneasily. Without hesitation, the hero poured the poison into the well, then turned to Universe and scolded him for being late, calling him useless. Moments later, the water in the well began to stir. From the darkness rose Lady Aiden, her form glowing faintly in the night. Her expression was twisted with fury. She lunged at the hero, forcing him to the ground as he tried to defend himself, shouting for her to stop. Universe stood frozen, shocked and unsure what to do. Night fell. Lady Aiden, now poisoned and weak, curled up beside the well, trembling and crying softly. Universe approached her and sat down nearby. Her voice was faint as she said that if this poison spread, all the village wells would die too. With guilt heavy on his face, Universe said he was deeply sorry for what the hero had done. He didn't dare ask for forgiveness, only for permission to try one thing. Lady Aiden looked up through her tears and asked what he meant. Universe lifted his hands toward the sky, calling for the spirits of nature to gather. "If you agree," he said softly, "I'll need your help." Lady Aiden waited, unsure what to expect. All around them, tiny glowing lights began to appear, fireflies that shimmered like stars. The spirits gathered, surrounding Lady Aiden with warmth and light. She gasped in amazement, realizing they were the ancient spirits of the spring. The little fairies danced around her, cleansing the poison from her body. As the light healed her, Lady Aiden looked at Universe with awe. In her eyes, he wasn't just an ordinary man anymore. He was a prince who had saved her life. The world around them seemed to sparkle like a dream. Universe smiled gently, reached out his hand, and said that everything would be all right now. They should go. Lady Aiden took his hand, and for a moment, it felt like they were floating, rising together under the stars. Back in the present, when the villagers heard the real story, they were stunned. They couldn't believe their so-called hero had been the one to poison the well. Murmurs spread through the crowd that Lady Aiden had come to love the humble worker, not the arrogant hero. Lady Aiden, glowing faintly, turned toward them and asked why they still doubted her. She pushed up her bangs, revealing a glowing mark on her forehead, the ancient symbol for, well, her body began to shine brightly, forcing the villagers to cover their eyes. They whispered in awe that her power had reached the highest level, the fourth and final tier of a true water spirit. Beaming with joy, Lady Iden raised her hands to the sky, declaring that she was overflowing with happiness now that she had reunited with Universe. Water erupted from the well behind her like a fountain, spraying into the air. Across the village, every well filled and overflowed with clear, pure water. The villagers cried out in joy, saying the hero had made Lady Iden happy again. Someone joked that maybe her good mood had more to do with beating up the hero earlier. Meanwhile, that same hero Braban was quietly sneaking away. Lady Iden turned to the village chief and announced that she needed to correct everyone's misunderstanding. It wasn't the hero she loved, it was Universe. With a confident smile, she said that as long as Universe stayed near her, she would always be full of joy, and the well would never run dry again. The villagers bowed deeply before her. Universe felt a wave of relief. The truth was finally out. Just then, he felt someone grab his hand. He turned and saw Typhon clinging to him, her cheeks puffed out and eyes averted. Confused, he asked what was wrong. She shook her head quickly, her face flushed, saying it was nothing. The village chief stepped forward, knelt before Universe, and apologized sincerely for the way she had treated him before. Embarrassed, he scratched his neck and said it was all fine. The old woman smiled warmly, calling him their savior and asking him to make himself at home. As she led them toward the inn, Universe glanced back at Lady Iden, the spirit who now smiled at him with gentle, grateful eyes. Lady Iden sat quietly on the edge of her well, watching Universe with a soft, wistful smile. She said sadly that she couldn't leave the well no matter how much she wanted to. Universe smiled back and promised that before leaving the village, he would stop by to see her again. Hearing that, Lady Iden's face brightened with a sweet, grateful smile. At the entrance of the inn, Universe and Typhon were greeted by a cheerful young woman in a kimono. She welcomed them warmly, wishing them a pleasant stay, and explained that the place hadn't officially opened yet, so they were the only guests. She led them to a room, proudly saying it was the best one in the house. Typhon immediately liked it. She twirled around the floor, admiring the space. The hostess smiled and mentioned that their biggest attraction wasn't just the rooms, but the hot spring baths, both indoor and open air, right under the night sky. Typhon perked up, walking out onto the balcony and looking down excitedly. She asked about the outdoor baths, and Universe suggested they go relax there. Typhon eagerly agreed. The open-air bath was surrounded by smooth wooden walls, and steam drifted lazily from the warm water. Universe leaned back in the pool, surrounded by small, glowing spirits splashing playfully. "You all worked hard today," he said with a relaxed grin. A sound came from behind him. He turned and froze. Typhon was walking toward the bath, her hair tied up, wrapped in a towel, smiling. "Hey, this is the men's side," Universe blurted out in surprise. She shrugged, still smiling. "There's no one in the women's bath. It's lonely there." Before he could argue, she dipped a toe into the water and asked sweetly, "Mind if I join? No one else is here anyway." Universe hesitated, flustered, then gave in. "Fine." Typhon slowly stepped into the pool, sighing in delight. "Ah, this feels amazing. It's like all my tiredness just vanished." Universe chuckled. "Yeah, a lot happened today." Typhon nodded. "I was terrified when I thought that guy was the real hero. He didn't feel like one at all, though. His aura was off." Universe leaned back, thinking, "Spirits and humans often see people differently," he said. Typhon looked thoughtful for a moment, then suddenly stood up and pointed down from the balcony. Maybe that's where the fake hero is right now. Below, they could see Braben bruised and swollen, sitting grumpily on a chair. A girl knelt beside him, obediently cleaning his face. He nudged her impatiently with his foot, ordering her to hurry up. The villagers nearby whispered to each other, mocking him and saying how Lady Iden had beaten him senseless. One of the townsfolk stopped the girl's hand and told her she didn't need to serve that fraud anymore, that she should leave him be. She hesitated but didn't argue. Braben's face twisted in rage as he shouted, claiming he was the hero and demanding obedience. Several young men stepped forward, blocking him. They told him off, saying that anyone who disrespected Lady Iden didn't deserve to stay in the village. If she got angry again, the wells could dry up once more. Braban jumped up, screaming that he'd have their families thrown out of town since his parents owned land here. The men ignored him and walked away, but the girl he'd been yelling at glanced back once, her eyes full of uncertainty. As Braban cursed the villagers, the water in the well suddenly erupted into a towering fountain. With a yelp, he was launched into the air, spinning helplessly. "Help! I'm freezing! Somebody help me!" he cried. From the bath above, Universe and Typhon watched him fly past. Universe smirked and said dryly, "The baths here are great, and the view's definitely entertaining." Typhon wiped her hand, laughing. "I guess I don't have to worry about marrying that jerk or washing his back anymore. I'm so lucky." Universe looked at her and smiled. She noticed, blushed, and splashed some water to distract herself. Then, she grinned mischievously and said, "Hey, Universe, want me to wash your back instead?" Universe froze, caught off guard, staring at her in shock as she giggled into the steam. Universe had reminded her that she'd just said she didn't want to rub anyone's back. The girl replied that it only applied to the hero because he'd treated her and the spirits poorly. But Universe wasn't like that. She wanted to thank him somehow for his kindness, even in a small way. Typhon smiled and kept offering the guy a favor. He thought for a moment, looked at the sky, and asked her not to do it too hard. She agreed. The guy sat on a chair wearing a towel and waited. The girl knelt beside him, smiling as she rubbed Universe's back. Typhon noticed the scratches on his skin. The girl froze for a moment and stepped back, commenting on the state of his back. Universe stayed calm. Typhon asked why it was so wounded. The girl pointed to a scar with the word "stupid" carved into it and asked about it. Universe explained that during the campaign against the Demon Lord, he'd always been used as bait. He'd been forced to open trapped chests, and sometimes, his comrades had taken out their anger on him. As he spoke, the girl's expression grew sadder. Typhon couldn't stand it anymore and hugged him from behind, feeling pity. The girl began to cry and asked why. After everything he'd gone through, he still tried so hard to help others when his own wounds ran so deep. Universe smiled and said that it wasn't his body that mattered, he just didn't want the spirits under his care or his inventions to be hurt. That's why he always looked out for everyone around him. The girl wiped her tears, took a breath, and said that since his body had been mistreated for so long, she would take care of him properly now. The guy turned to her, surprised. She and her little helpers began to wash him with enthusiasm. He burst into laughter, begging them to stop because it tickled too much. It was oddly pleasant. Later, the girl sat beside him, smiling. The guy went back to the room first, still laughing, and said he'd had a great time but was exhausted. He decided to make the futon before Typhon returned. Universe walked in, drying his hair with a towel, and froze when he saw 7 beautiful girls in robes sitting around his futon. They called him Lord Universe, and said he was the savior of their village, so they had to guard his body that night. One girl flirted playfully, asking him to accept their gratitude. Universe stepped back in shock as they surrounded him. One of them pulled off her robe's belt with her mouth and shyly loosened it, revealing his chest and stomach. She touched his skin, and Universe shut his eyes, praying for rescue. Suddenly, the girls were thrown across the room. Some even flew out the window. Typhon had unleashed her magic to protect Universe from the overly affectionate villagers. He quickly adjusted his robe and thanked her for saving him. Typhon stood there, blushing, clutching the collar of her robe. He tried to speak, but she knelt and lowered her head, saying that even though her magic was rough, she wanted him to take care of her too. Blushing deeper, she added that Universe had always looked after her, so now it was her turn. He stared at her, confused, while she looked away. Then, suddenly, Typhon climbed onto the futon and insisted on guarding him through the night so he could rest properly. The guy frowned and asked if she even knew what that meant. She said she did and pulled out a book, flipping through it until she found a section about night guarding. Reading aloud, she said the first step was to rest his head on her lap. She straightened up and closed her eyes, inviting him to lie down. Universe rested his head on her knees. Typhon blushed but began searching for the next step. She asked if he was comfortable, saying she needed to make sure before continuing. He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. She nodded thoughtfully and said she needed to tell a proper bedtime story. After a moment of thinking, she began. The guy looked up at her as she spoke. She tried to make a scary face while telling a story her friend, the spirit Fuchi, had told her something about a haunted portrait in a music room that came to life at night. But halfway through, she got flustered, stumbled over her words, and started scolding herself for being terrible at storytelling. Then she suddenly remembered. The guy closed his eyes and asked if she really thought bedtime stories were supposed to be ghost stories. When he sat up, he hit his head hard. The girl leaned back, swinging her legs because they'd gone numb. She winced in pain, trying to stretch them out. Universe turned to look at her, amused by her awkward flailing, and smiled. When he looked again, he saw that she'd already fallen fast asleep, snoring softly. Chuckling, he whispered that she drifted off so quickly like a kitten. He paused for a moment, realizing how long it had been since they'd laughed and felt this relaxed. As he pulled out the blanket, the girl mumbled in her sleep, thanking him and saying how happy she felt beside him. Universe quietly watched her, laid out the futon, and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. He smiled and thanked her for her kind words. Outside, the night was deep and still. He wished her good night before drifting off himself. By morning, the boy woke up and sat up from his futon. The room was a mess, everything scattered. When he stepped outside, he spotted Typhon asleep on the broken wall, surrounded by fallen leaves. Smiling, he gently picked her up so she wouldn't wake. Just then, the village chief appeared behind them, greeting them with a warm, "Good morning." The old woman chuckled, saying she'd noticed how much fun the two had had yesterday. She mentioned that renovations had already started and that Lady Eden was working hard, so everything was going smoothly. She also said that the workers were putting up signs around the area. Typhon began to stir and slowly opened her eyes. When she looked ahead and realized she was being carried, she blushed and quickly floated out of Universe's arms. Then she noticed the painting nearby and blinked in surprise, asking what it was. The village chief smiled and said it was a painting of Universe saving Lady Eden. The old woman explained that the villagers had drunk water from Lady Eden's well their whole lives, and that their happiness depended on hers. She said she'd finally realized that truth. Then, bowing deeply before Universe, she announced that from now on, she would no longer honor the old hero but instead pay her respects only to Lady Eden and her beloved Universe. He looked flustered and asked her not to do that. The chief simply smiled and said that Lady Eden herself had sent her to remind him to visit soon. Later, Universe and Typhon climbed the mountain toward Lady Eden's shrine, chatting about the new posters hung around town. Typhon mentioned that one of them made her look like Nurukiara, the earth spirit. Laughing, she said that spirit was very popular. Universe smiled and told her that, to him, she was just as beautiful. When they reached the well, Lady Eden stood waiting with a sword in her hands. She greeted him, calling him Lord Universe, and explained that she was holding the legendary sacred sword of the well. She asked him to take it with him. Typhon stepped back in shock, repeating the old legend that whoever drew the sword from the well would release water that turned the blade into a weapon of flowing water, powerful enough to slice even the moon. Lady Eden nodded, saying the legend was true. Universe hesitated, asking why she would entrust him with something so precious. He explained that if the old hero had ordered him, he could never have returned the sword. Lady Eden sighed and told him that when she had traveled with the hero long ago, he demanded the sacred sword again. When she refused, he had poured poison into her well, once more stronger than before. Universe was stunned and asked if the hero had truly done it again. She nodded sadly, saying she had to sleep at the bottom of the well to purify the poison and save her people. That was why the well had run dry. The two listened quietly as Lady Eden continued. Smiling gently, she said she'd watched Universe the previous day and had become certain that he was the one worthy of wielding the sacred sword, the Sword of Oidon. Lady Odon's face suddenly shifted to one of alarm. She asked Universe to accept the sword, saying it belonged to her, and urging him to always keep it with him. Typhon looked at him with soft, pleading eyes and added her voice, asking him to take Lady Odon's gift. Hearing their words, Universe finally took the sword with both hands and examined it closely. He looked up at Lady Odon and smiled, promising that he would take good care of it. The Lady of the Well relaxed, tilting her head slightly with a gentle smile, saying everything was fine now. Still smiling, she spread her arms as her body began to dissolve into light. The two stood frozen, not understanding what was happening. Typhon called out in panic, but Lady Odon only rose higher, her figure fading as she said they would surely meet again. Typhon shouted that the lady knew she'd disappear after giving away the sword, but Lady Odon only smiled warmly. Universe called her name, his voice trembling. The spirit watched them one last time and said she was grateful for their kindness and happy to have met them. As she disappeared, she thanked them and wished them farewell. Typhon reached out toward her, tears running down her face, begging her to wait, saying she couldn't just vanish now that they were friends. Universe stood quietly, his heart heavy as Lady Odon's light faded into the sunset. Her name echoed in the mountain, carried by Typhon's sobs as the sun sank behind the peaks. When they walked back down to the village, Typhon wiped her tears, still sniffling. Universe walked beside her silently. Suddenly, a voice asked why she was crying. Startled, Typhon turned and saw Lady Odan sitting by the well, smiling as if nothing had happened. Typhon froze, pointing a trembling finger at her, and stammered that she'd just seen her die. Universe stood beside her, speechless. Lady Odan laughed softly and said that she had been in a dark place yesterday and had felt ready to fade away. But after meeting Universe, she was filled with happiness again. She explained that now she was no longer bound to the well and could move freely between other wells. She thanked them both for taking the burden of the sword and said she was truly happy. Typhon's face twisted with tears and relief, muttering that she felt tricked. Universe laughed, glad that everything turned out fine. Meanwhile, far away, a thin-faced man in a work uniform was angrily tapping a screwdriver against a metal mechanism. He muttered to himself that it was impossible that his great master, Gatsuan, had been dismissed and replaced by that arrogant Universe as Minister of the Universe. He grumbled that Universe had stolen the position that rightfully belonged to him, and that he'd find a way to make up for his past failures with the false hero. Pressing his forehead against his invention, he whispered that this time, his newest creation, the barbecue machine, would finally prove his genius. Down by the riverside, a tall archway with a sign welcomed guests to the Festival of King Vazwamp. Guards stood by, announcing that all spirit weddings had been cancelled, though the hero's festival was still underway. Another night added that the celebration honored the day of victory over the demon lord. In the background, Gatsuan, now called Goatsen, by some snapped his barbecue tongs and stood near a grill, pretending to stay calm. Nearby, guards murmured that the event might even be a diplomatic meeting. Goatsen stepped forward and greeted King Vazwamp warmly, thanking him for attending. The king, a cheerful man with silver hair, a thick mustache, and a bright beach shirt with the hero's face printed on it, smiled back. Goatsen proudly announced that tonight's dinner featured premium ingredients, all cooked on a brand new grill of his own design. The king's eyes lit up, saying he'd heard that the new device was the final masterpiece of Minister Goatsen, the greatest magical engineer in the world. Goatsen grinned and said he'd improved it so anyone could control the flame with ease. Holding up the tongs, he declared that all one needed to do was load the ingredients, turn on the machine, and enjoy a barbecue worthy of a hero. The king, intrigued, stood up from his seat. Goatsen gestured toward the device and politely invited the king to turn the handle himself to test out his latest invention. The king agreed and turned the handle, saying it must be the ignition system. A second later, the device exploded right in front of his face. The crowd gasped in horror as flames burst out, engulfing the king. People screamed his name and rushed toward him while he stumbled into the water, trying to put out the fire. His vassals quickly surrounded him as healers began to chant spells and treat his burns. The ministers turned on Gatsuan immediately, shouting that he had tried to assassinate the king. They accused him of planning it all, forcing His Majesty to turn the handle himself. Gatsuan raised his hands defensively, shouting that it was an accident. His mind raced. He remembered testing the same device at home without any problem. Why now? He thought in panic. Beneath the grill, the enraged spirits of flame and forest whispered furiously that Gatsuan had fired Universe and stolen his achievements. Their anger boiled, declaring such treachery unforgivable. One of the vassals lunged at Gatsuan, shouting that the traitor would pay for his crime. Gatsuan fell to the ground, shielding his head and screaming. Then, a calm voice cut through the chaos. The king, drenched but alive, wiped the soot from his face and said hoarsely that even geniuses could fail even someone as renowned as Gatsuan. The room went silent. The vassals froze, waiting for his judgment. Gatsuan immediately knelt before the king, trembling, and insisted that he wasn't the one who had built the machine. He dramatically wiped away a fake tear and claimed the true inventor was none other than Universe, the same man who had kidnapped the spirit princess. He begged for mercy, insisting he had been framed. The king frowned and asked, "Didn't you just say this invention was yours? The engraving on the grill even bears your name." Gatsuan's eyes widened. He realized he'd just trapped himself in his own lie. The hero, sitting nearby, stood up and glared at him. "Stop making excuses," he said coldly. "Own up to your failure." Gatsuan stared at him in disbelief, stunned that his former comrade would turn on him so easily. Breben, another minister, glared at Gatsuan with disgust, thinking that this reckless fool needed to be dismissed immediately before he caused even more damage. Gatsuan bit his fingernail nervously, his mind racing. He remembered the days after the demon lord's defeat, when he and the hero had celebrated by grilling meat together, laughing, even setting Universe's clothes on fire as a joke. Trying to save himself, Gatsuan suddenly shouted that it had all been Breben's idea, that he'd ordered him to surprise people by setting them on fire with the barbecue machine. Breben's face twisted with rage. "What are you saying?" he barked, storming toward him. "You've gone mad." Gatsuan grabbed the hero by the collar and pulled him close, whispering frantically that if he confessed now, they'd both be punished, and that his plan had been to win favor with King Vazwamp's inner circle. The hero stared blankly, not understanding a word of it. Still trying to save face, Gatsuan straightened up and gestured toward the king. "Look how young and energetic His Majesty is," he cried. "If we liven things up with a bit of flair, he'll surely be pleased." The king stood motionless, his expression dark with disappointment. Undeterred, Gatsuan and Breben launched into a clumsy performance. Gatsuan loudly praised the barbecue device as the greatest invention of the century, while Breben feigned astonishment, shouting compliments. The hero joined in, putting a hand on the king's shoulder as if they were old friends and declaring how impressive it all was. Breben followed suit, adding a forced, "Splendid work." But instead of being amused, King Vazwamp's face hardened. His voice turned cold as he condemned them for their arrogance. He said it was disgraceful that they hurt people for amusement, then failed to take responsibility. His words cut like a blade as he accused them of treating cruelty as entertainment. Finally, he glared at them both, the once great hero and the kingdom's most celebrated engineer, and said that he was deeply disappointed to see that the saviors of the world had become nothing more than selfish, unbearable men. When the king finished, Bourbon and Gatsuan looked stunned, and instead of protesting properly, all they managed was a garbled, shouted formal reply. His Majesty then announced that the men who'd taken refuge in their lands would be arrested. He said he'd meant to bring it up at the joint barbecue to underline how serious the meeting was, but for now he'd pretend the whole thing never happened. He added that he wanted to rethink relations with their country. He was deeply disappointed and didn't want to deal with them anymore. After the king left, Breben suddenly screamed the magic mechanic's name so loudly his face twisted with fury. He accused Gatsuan of incompetence and said the engineer should have been overseeing everything personally from the start, not trusting anyone else. Catching his breath, the fair-haired man coldly declared that under normal circumstances, Gatsuan would already have been fired. Given the festival, he'd settle for demoting him 2 ranks from minister down to assistant minister. Gatsuan was stunned. He hadn't expected such a demotion. As the festival wound down, he walked the streets in a daze, thinking about his son who wanted to follow in his footsteps. He felt bitter, knowing he couldn't tell his family about the humiliation. He didn't want them to be mocked. He decided to hide the truth and act like he'd reclaim his post before any official changes were announced. That thought cheered him up and steeled his resolve to get his position back. Heading toward his office hopeful, he heard muffled voices behind his half-open door and peered through the crack. Inside, 2 men were putting on a ridiculous show, mock-congratulating a doll made to look like Mr. Universe for being appointed minister. Furious at the insult, Gatsuan burst in, teeth bared, and shouted that they were trashing someone else's honor, that the office wasn't a place for a doll. The pair turned, sneered, and taunted him with his new title, testing whether he'd accept the fall. Panicked, Gatsuan demanded to know how they'd learned about his demotion. One of them calmly said a nun who'd been at the banquet had told them everything. They added that Mr. Universe had been appointed minister, so their doll rehearsal was practice for the reception. Unable to take it, Gatsuan insisted it didn't matter, he was still their boss. Then a man barged in, kicked Gatsuan to the floor, and called him a loser. The newcomer announced himself as the new leader and ordered the others to call Gatsuan by his reduced title. The beatings continued until the former minister lay on the floor, crying out in pain while the group mocked his misfortune. Gritting his teeth, Gatsuan vowed he'd take revenge once he was back in power. The new leader only smirked, clearly unconcerned by the threats. Seeing how weak Gatsuan's chances were, the new boss asked a rhetorical question. Would Mr. Universe really appoint the man who'd mocked him as a minister? Then he casually revealed that they'd decided, after talking it over, to rough Gatsuan up because they figured Universe would be pleased to see his offender humbled. He said those actions would make up for all the humiliations they'd once caused their master. With a sarcastic tone, he added that it was their turn now to act in a Gatsuan way. Hearing that, Gatsuan finally realized how much his own situation mirrored what Universe had gone through. He let out a desperate cry and blurted that he was willing to do all of Appel's dirtiest work from then on. His irritated boss snapped at him to get out, shouting insults that made it painfully clear how far the former minister had fallen. A line of carriages rolled down the road, drawn by mechanical horses whose metal joints clicked in rhythm with their steps. Inside one of them, King Waswamp sat fuming, thinking bitterly that he'd never imagined people so awful could ever be called heroes. His voice carried pure disappointment. An attendant respectfully informed him they were nearing the border and asked him to look outside, his tone uneasy despite the formality. The king glanced out the window and froze. Soldiers were standing in formation, their ranks spelling out a huge message claiming that Universe was to blame for everything and should be brought back. Waswamp's confusion turned to fury. He couldn't believe the offenders still showed no remorse. As they continued down the road, he saw a sign announcing that Lake Ricot was ahead. Seething, the king ordered the owner to take down all those offensive signs immediately. The man nervously replied that they'd already been removed. Then the king's eyes caught another sign. It showed a young man standing beside Princess Typhona. Recognizing the man as Universe, he stared in shock. Someone nearby asked if he knew him, then explained with pride that the young man was a famous traveler whose adventures had become legends. The king, still surprised, asked what kind of story they meant. The man eagerly told him that Universe was not only an incredible cook, but had once set a record by catching a giant Mosin fish, knocking Braban from first place. The king sighed and said that despite those feats, Universe had still kidnapped Princess Typhona. The owner frowned and asked if the person the king meant had a spirit, because if so, that accusation made no sense. A woman beside him chimed in, saying the two had looked inseparable like lovers. Another passerby added that the princess had fiercely defended Universe from anyone who mocked him, as if the insults were aimed at her too. A girl from the crowd smiled and said their bond was beautiful. The king looked again at the image of the young man and the princess. Thinking of the story about the giant Mosin, he couldn't help but smile. Meanwhile, the two of them rode in a carriage together. The princess asked if the water in the ponds was safe to drink. Universe said he'd heard it usually was, especially in ponds where spirits lived. Their waters were pure and could even restore a traveler's strength. Typhon's eyes lit up. She guessed that must have been how he'd kept his strength during his journeys, and curiously asked what it tasted like. He laughed and said he hadn't gained strength from drinking water, which surprised her. Then an idea came to her. Since neither of them had ever tried such water, they should go drink some. She admitted she'd always wanted to, but never had the chance. Universe said there was a fountain nearby, the Fountain of Souls, right by the road where he'd once stopped while traveling. That made the princess even more excited. She cheerfully declared they should hurry there to taste the magical water. Together, Typhon and Universe rode toward their destination on the mechanical horse Trance. Smiling, she said she couldn't wait to drink from the fountain. She was so thirsty her throat felt completely dry. The spirit's refuge was hidden deep in the forest, and finding it wasn't easy. The last time the guy had been there, during the battle with the Lord, they had searched for it for ages. As Universe looked around, his eyes fell on a strange structure in the distance. It looked like a statue, though he couldn't tell exactly what it was. He noticed that this unusual statue worked well as a landmark, making the place easier to find. But his attention soon shifted elsewhere. He spotted an old temple with an inscription carved into the stone, calling it the Cathedral of the Source. While he was still trying to take in how much everything had changed, Typhon greeted someone nearby. The temple doors creaked open, and a tired-looking nun stepped out. She greeted them politely at first, calling the place the Haven of the Spirits of the Spring. But the moment she recognized one of the visitors, her expression changed completely. When she saw Universe, her face twisted with anger and disbelief. Trembling, she accused him of having the nerve to show up in such a sacred place and demanded to know why he was there. Universe mumbled something under his breath, but his companion smiled gently and explained that they had only come to drink some water from the fountain. The nun hesitated, then reluctantly invited them inside and told them to make themselves comfortable. She softened her tone but still asked Universe to be respectful toward the local spirits. Typhon immediately defended him, insisting passionately that he would never behave disrespectfully. The princess, still unconvinced, turned to Universe, but before he could respond, another woman appeared and guided them toward the fountain. The area was beautifully decorated, as if a festival were about to begin. The girl stepped forward first, leaning toward the bubbling water, but the woman warned her that although the water was safe to drink, it could have unpredictable effects on the body. Disappointed, Typhon admitted this wasn't what she had expected. The woman shot her a sarcastic look and said she should blame Universe for that. She explained that the young man had once come there with the hero's squad and something terrible had happened. He had crucified the spirit and used it as target practice. If that sounded unbelievable, the woman said, they could ask the hero himself. Since that day, she explained, the spirits had stayed away, leaving the place nearly abandoned. Many attempts had been made to bring the spirits back and earn their forgiveness. That was why the cathedral had been built. The spirits were timid, but the nun had hoped that if she waited patiently, maybe one would return. She had decorated everything in preparation for their return. But now, heartbroken and close to tears, she said it was all over because with Universe standing near the fountain, no spirit would ever come back. Typhon tried to reassure her, saying it was all just a misunderstanding. The nun turned, tears streaming down her face, demanding to know what Typhon meant. Then she froze. Typhon spun around and saw that Universe was surrounded by countless spirits, so many that he was barely visible, like he was fading inside a shimmering veil of light. The woman gasped, overwhelmed, and shouted about the unbelievable number of spirits in the spring. Even the outline of his body was hard to see through the glowing shapes. "How is this even possible?" she cried before collapsing. The guy and the girl rushed to her side, realizing she had fainted. They carried her inside, covered her with a blanket, and laid her down to rest. She soon developed a fever, tossing and turning, muttering in her sleep about her friends leaving her and how lonely she was. When she finally woke up, Typhon handed her some water, saying it was just ordinary water. The nun thanked her softly and took a few sips. The girl said she'd had a dream where the young man was surrounded by the spirits of the spring, but when she mentioned it, someone told her it hadn't been a dream at all. Even if it was, she said, she was still happy because if that guy could really summon the spirits, then it was a wonderful thing. The nun then turned to him and asked for forgiveness for how rudely she had spoken before. He scratched his head awkwardly and said it was fine, nothing to worry about. Since it was already late, the lady offered to let them spend the night there. By the time everyone went to bed, the place had gone completely quiet. Only Universe was awake. He sat up, got out of bed, and quietly slipped outside, careful not to wake anyone. He walked toward the garden where the spring was. The decorations there sparkled softly in the moonlight. He began to take them down one by one, murmuring that they were beautiful but probably too bright for the spirits, that they might even scare them away. As he worked, he suddenly felt someone watching him. Peeking from behind a tree was a small figure. He noticed her and whispered that she must have just been born, and gently told her not to be afraid since nothing was shining any. He reached out his hand to her, but the tiny spirit girl flinched back. He softly said he could help her get out of hiding, but she shut her eyes and bit his finger instead, trembling with fear. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the small wound but noticed that he hadn't pulled his hand away. He just looked at her and smiled slightly. That surprised her. He asked if she felt calmer now and told her not to worry, he wasn't her enemy. Then the little spirit licked his finger, healing the wound completely. She looked guilty, but he told her not to worry, that he wasn't mad at all. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she said she wanted to be his friend. He smiled and held out his palm, inviting her to sit. The moment she did, dozens of glowing spirits appeared around him, filling the garden with soft light. He was shocked but laughed, saying he was happy to see them, but that they didn't all need to crowd him like that, maybe come one at a time. He immediately regretted saying it though, because they actually formed a long line, waiting their turn. He couldn't help but laugh again, and soon the spirits surrounded him all at once. From the window, the nun had been watching. Her eyes widened as she whispered in disbelief that the spirits of the spring had really come back. She muttered that it was strange they should have hated Universe, but instead, they seemed to have missed him. Typhon joined her, saying that he had always been kind to the spirits, which was why they adored him. The nun turned to Typhon and asked if she was a wind spirit. Typhon apologized for not introducing herself earlier and told her name. The black-haired nun froze, repeating the name in shock. It belonged to one of the princesses of that element. Typhon looked a little embarrassed and admitted that yes, she really was that princess. The nun was so stunned she screamed out loud, the sound echoing through the night. Universe came running, alarmed, asking what had happened. He saw Typhon blushing and fiddling with her hair while the nun was kneeling, begging forgiveness for not recognizing a princess. In the haven of the spirits, everything revolved around them. Royal spirits were treated with the highest honor, even though humans were considered higher in the general hierarchy. Here, the spirits' rank mattered deeply. Typhon tried to calm her down, saying it wasn't a big deal. Meanwhile, the small spirit girl looked at the scene with wide eyes, delighted to see the spring spirits again. She asked them if they loved Universe. Without waiting for an answer, she giggled, said she loved him too, and jumped into his arms. The nun watched the two of them, completely bewildered, wondering why these normally shy and distant spirits cared so much about him. Universe looked away, and Typhon spoke for him. She said that he gave off a kind of warmth, gentle and comforting, like the scent of flowers that wrapped around her and drew her close, just like a butterfly drawn to a bloom. The nun, still sitting on the floor, lowered her head again and quietly asked him to explain how the spirits could be brought back to their haven. Universe hesitated, then asked her why she wanted to know. She looked up at him sadly and began to explain. The forest around them, she said, was being cut down more and more each day to make room for the cathedral's expansion. If things went on like this, the forest would disappear completely, replaced by a walking park. That meant the spirits would lose their home entirely. Her voice trembled as she asked for his help, saying she couldn't handle it alone. Universe stuttered a bit, trying to respond, but then said he understood. Everyone smiled after that, especially the nun, whose face lit up with hope. The next morning, Universe began explaining what needed to be done. He said that the creatures of the spring didn't like bright light unless it was reflected in the water. So, all the decorations had to be taken down. The nun's face fell. She admitted she hadn't known that and had thought the sparkles and ornaments would make the spirits happy. Typhon, finishing up the cleaning, asked if there was anything else to do and offered to clean the fountain water herself. But Universe told her not to bother, the spirits would take care of it. Springs inhabited by spirits, he explained, naturally purified themselves, though it could take up to 10 years. He didn't finish the sentence before grinning and turning to the spirits. He said playfully that if anyone wanted to have some fun helping him clean the water, they could sit on his finger. Instantly, dozens of little glowing figures gathered around him, covering his hand like a tiny mushroom cap made of light. Laughing, he pointed toward the fountain and said, "All right, let's go." The spirits fluttered through the air, dancing and working together to clean the spring. Everyone watching stood in awe. The scene was magical, bright, lively, and full of joy. The nun gasped when she saw how clear the water became. Then her expression turned sad. She admitted she had been foolish and naive, thinking she'd known everything about spirits just because she'd grown up in the haven. Typhon walked over and gently patted her head, trying to cheer her up, saying that what mattered was that she truly tried to understand them. The nun smiled faintly and agreed. Typhon continued, pointing out that the nun treated spirits like people, not like animals, which most humans did. She smiled warmly, saying that spirits were happiest when they were treated as equals. The nun nodded, understanding now, and asked if she could ever become like her teacher. Typhon blinked and asked who she meant, and the woman pointed toward Universe. He was sitting off to the side, quietly watching their talk, a small smile tugging at his lips, as if he already knew how the moment would end. Typhon went on to say that, unlike her, Universe was much more popular among the wind spirits. The nun agreed, calling him extraordinary. Typhon smiled brightly and said she thought so too. He was truly amazing. Their eyes sparkled with excitement as they turned to him together and joyfully said that he was their teacher. At that moment, Universe was busy carving something out of wood with a knife, surrounded by curious spirits watching his every move. Typhon came closer, impressed, and asked if he could really do that too. She wondered if he was making a platform for the spirits of the haven. He nodded and said he was. Before he could say more, the nun interrupted, saying that the hero had once claimed he built everything here for the spirits himself. Typhon frowned and said she doubted that was true, then turned to Universe to confirm. He looked nervous, and before he could answer, the nun, her tone more bitter, now admitted that the so-called hero had in fact been cruel and treated the spirits terribly. She couldn't believe it at first and refused to accept what she'd heard. Then she slowly crouched down, leaned toward the floor, and began apologizing for her ignorance. Universe, startled and confused, nervously asked her to lift her head, but she shook it slightly and said she wasn't worthy of it. She admitted she'd made a terrible mistake in how she had treated him. As she spoke, a sudden panic crossed her face. She realized it wasn't only her fault. Another nun from a neighboring cathedral had also done something wrong. Unsure what to do, she got up quickly and urged the others to follow her. Typhon and Universe exchanged confused looks, but went after her. They climbed to the top floor of the cathedral and entered a large room. The woman pulled the cloth off something massive, and beneath it stood a statue. Typhon gasped, covering her mouth in shock. The statue was an exact copy of the hero who had once saved the country. Universe blinked and asked if she really thought so. Typhon stepped closer, trying to understand what the statue was for. The nun hesitated, then admitted that their cathedral had been competing with the neighboring one. Both had decided to create statues of the hero and see which one would attract more spring spirits. The statues would then be presented to King Waswamp, who would choose the winner. Hearing this, Typhon frowned and asked how it had come to that. The nun sighed and said that without the spirits, they couldn't maintain the place. If the spirits didn't return, the cathedral would eventually fall apart. So, they'd tried to borrow the hero's image from each other, hoping his likeness would draw the spirits back. But now she understood that the statue couldn't summon spirits at all. She admitted she had no idea what to do next. Typhon suddenly clapped her hands and said cheerfully that the solution was simple. They could make a statue of Universe instead. Universe's face turned red as he realized what she meant. The nun hesitated, reminding them that the king was due to arrive in a few days to inspect the statues. But Typhon was firm, saying that if the real goal was to attract spirits, then nothing else mattered. The nun finally agreed. Typhon smiled brightly and said that if everyone helped, they would finish it in time. When she asked the spirits for their thoughts, they answered with a joyful chorus of high-pitched squeaks, clear agreement. The two women were thrilled, and it was decided that they would build a statue of Universe. But Universe quickly refused, saying it wasn't right for someone to make a statue of themselves. His voice shook slightly, and everyone stared at him in surprise. Their jaws dropped, and they started questioning him, insisting that he was skilled enough to do it. Flustered, he admitted that was true, but said it still felt far too awkward. Typhon crossed her arms and suddenly asked about what had happened in Iden Village. Universe looked uncomfortable and replied that it was her fault. Tears welled up in her eyes as she asked if her feelings for him were really so wrong. She told him she thought he was amazing, that people admired him, and if his statue stood in the cathedral, everyone would see how wonderful he was. He sighed quietly, realizing she wouldn't give up, and agreed to make the statue. Typhon smiled through her tears and thanked him, overjoyed that they could work together on something. He thought about her words, work together, and realized that as long as she was happy, that was enough for him. When he finished sculpting the body, everyone was amazed. It looked perfect, so lifelike it almost seemed ready to move. They excitedly declared that they'd handle the head themselves. But as they started shaping it, things went wrong. They reworked it again and again, each time making it worse. Eventually, frustration built up. Typhon's patience snapped, and when a young man from the village wandered in to watch, she immediately told him to leave. As he walked away, he muttered that if they kept shaving the face down, it would end up tiny. Typhon clenched her fists, trying to stay calm, and muttered that her inner artist just wouldn't wake up. She sighed, saying that sculpting wasn't about forcing your own vision, but uncovering the true shape hidden inside the stone. Universe stayed quiet, watching her struggle. After a while, he called her over and gently suggested they ask the earth spirits for help. Her eyes lit up instantly, and her bad mood vanished. She was amazed that the little spirits could understand such delicate work so well and happily agreed. Smiling, she said they should all make Universe Kun together. She dramatically adjusted her glasses, pushed her coat aside, and struck a confident pose, trying to look as cool as possible. Keeping that majestic attitude, she started directing the sculpting, saying the nose should be a bit more crooked, and the teeth needed a few chips to make the statue look more realistic. When it was almost done, she proudly declared that it already looked amazing, almost identical. Just then, a nun walked in and asked if everyone wanted to take a break to eat something. Everyone happily agreed it was time to rest and recharge. The spring and earth spirits joined in too, sipping tea and munching on sugar cubes. Laughter filled the room. Even Typhon looked content. Afterward, the head of the cathedral approached Universe and asked if he had a moment to talk about something important. He hesitated but nodded. She confessed that she wanted to learn how to connect with the spirits the way her teacher and he did. She admitted that she had always believed humans could only drive spirits away, and when she needed their help, she would trap them with nets, like catching insects. But he never did that, and somehow, the spirits still helped him. She wanted to understand how. He listened quietly, thinking for a while before replying that spirits like to be used. When they were asked to lend their power, they were actually happy because it made them feel needed. But, he added, that didn't mean they would open up to just anyone. Spirits never helped people who treated them only as tools for achieving goals. They weren't servants granting wishes. They were allies, partners in creating the future together. What he wanted most, he said softly, was for all the spirits around him to smile because he always cared about that. When he finished, everyone who had been listening was deeply moved. Typhon, her eyes glistening, asked why he was so kind because that made him such a rare and precious partner. Flustered, Universe waved his hands and begged them to stop saying things like that or at least say them differently. Even while embarrassed, he stayed polite, which made the girls burst out laughing. He crossed his arms and pouted in protest, which only made them laugh harder. Meanwhile, in the neighboring city, a gigantic statue of the hero Brabin towered over the streets. The nearby Founder Cathedral, known as a sanctuary for spirits, echoed with a frustrated cry. The high nun there was pacing nervously, wondering why the spring spirits still hadn't returned even after they had built such a grand statue. She muttered that if she didn't win this time, she'd never be recognized as a true nun. A knock came at the door. Regaining her composure, she called for the visitors to enter. A few young nuns stepped in with weekly donations and handed them over. She thanked them politely, blessed them in the spirit's name, and quickly sent them away. The moment the door closed, she dumped the coins onto her desk, letting them spill through her fingers. Then an idea struck her. The statue wasn't bright enough. If she made it shinier, more dazzling, she thought, the spirits would flock to it like moths to a flame. And once she did that, she planned to demolish the nearby spirit refuge, getting rid of that Holy Mother who was always in her way. That would give her control over the land, the power, and the money. She smiled to herself, imagining how everyone would soon bow to her success. But reality soon hit her again. She looked at an ornate chest covered in jewels and sighed. There was no money left from her patrons, and even the monks' wages couldn't be paid. On the table lay a letter warning that if the debt wasn't settled soon, she and the 5 saints of her cathedral would be sold into slavery. Just then, a man in a hat appeared, congratulating her on the profitable deal. He handed her a large chest full of gold coins. Overjoyed, she threw the coins into the air, laughing. She was sure that with this sparkling statue, she'd soon be famous throughout the entire pleasure district. Tomorrow, when King Wafamp attended the statue unveiling, she'd finally have her moment of triumph. The day of judgment had arrived, the day that would decide who the true winner was. Someone announced that it was finally time to decide which cathedral would be recognized as the true temple. The contest of statues was about to begin, and the speaker turned to King Wafamp, giving him the honor of judging the results. The king nodded and began the evaluation. The first statue to be presented was the largest one, standing proudly at the Cathedral of the Spring. At first glance, it looked impressive, but the king said that what mattered most wasn't its size or beauty, but how strongly it could attract the spirits of the spring. The great nun from the Spring Cathedral quickly assured everyone that they had prepared well for this. She boasted that once the cloth was removed, everyone would see the true face of the hero himself, and that the spirits would surely rush toward her statue, even knocking over the rival one nearby. Before she could finish, a younger nun nervously interrupted, apologizing for cutting in. She explained that their statue had been made through teamwork, that everyone had worked on it together. Her rival burst into mocking laughter, saying she didn't believe that because that girl was always alone. The remark made the younger nun's smile fade. Seeing the tension rise, King Wasvamp raised his hand to calm them down. He said that at his signal, both groups would remove the cloths at the same time. Everyone took their positions. The signal came. The cloths dropped. As the crowd gasped, the king's eyes widened in shock. One of the statues, the smaller one, was completely covered in a shimmering mist filled with the faint scent of perfume. And then, as the wind blew the mist aside, it became clear the statue wasn't of the hero Brabin at all. It was a statue of Universe. Even the great nun who had built the massive monument couldn't hold back her scream of disbelief. The king, puzzled but intrigued, leaned forward. "Is this statue truly dedicated to Universe?" he asked. The woman beside it bowed respectfully and asked if His Majesty knew the teacher. The king stammered, saying he hadn't met the man personally, but wherever he went, people spoke only good things about him. Typhon smiled proudly, her eyes shining. "Your Majesty is right," she said. "My teacher is an incredible person. No spirit in the world is as beloved as he is. Even his statue draws them near. It's like they can feel his kindness through it." The king nodded slowly, watching as countless spirits floated around the statue, glowing softly. "I can see that," he said. "They're smiling just like Princess Typhon herself." But before anyone could celebrate, The jealous nun from the other cathedral began shouting angrily. She accused Typhon of lying, claiming that spirits couldn't possibly be drawn to a statue of a false hero. She must have tamed them by force, she yelled. She's tricked everyone. This is disgusting. When the spirits realize what she's done, they'll turn against her forever. Her words hung in the air for only a moment before a sudden wind swept across the temple grounds. Everyone froze as the air grew thick with energy. The great nun stopped talking mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the forest. Then she smirked, thinking she had figured it out. "Look!" she cried dramatically, pointing toward the trees. "Even the forest weeps. The spring itself is angry." From the forest, glowing lights began to appear, spirits, hundreds of them, filling the sky. Gasps spread through the crowd as they drew nearer. The great nun threw her arms wide in triumph. "They're coming to me, to my hero!" she shouted. "All of them belong to me." But as the spirits approached, the air shimmered strangely. The nun pointed toward the rival statue and screamed, "Destroy the false hero! Destroy the statue of Universe!" The spirits surged forward, but not toward Universe's statue. They turned sharply mid-air and crashed full force into her own monument. The massive statue of Brabant shattered with a thunderous crack. The nun screamed in horror, clutching her head. "No, not that one! Stop! Stop!" she shrieked, her voice breaking. But the spirits didn't stop. The statue collapsed completely, sending huge fragments crashing into nearby buildings. People fled from their homes as debris and dust filled the streets. The great nun fell to her knees, watching everything crumble: the statue, the cathedral, and her dreams all reduced to rubble. When the chaos finally settled, silence returned. The Holy Mother of the Spring Cathedral approached the trembling group of rival nuns. They knelt before her, tearfully begging for forgiveness, admitting they had been wrong. Smiling gently, she extended her hand and said, "Our doors are always open to those who return. From now on, let's live in harmony with the spirits of the spring, just as the teacher Universe taught us." They all agreed at once, but before anyone could move, another Holy Mother stepped forward and blocked their way. Swaying threateningly, she shouted that she wouldn't let them leave with her nuns. Her voice grew sharper as she began to threaten the younger woman, saying she'd sell her into slavery and make sure she was left completely alone. Just then, a rough voice called out nearby, saying they had finally arrived at the right place. 3 men appeared, each carrying ropes and shackles. A tall, dark man led them. He stepped forward and asked where the saint was, the one who owed him a great deal of money. The angry Holy Mother quickly pointed to the other women, trying to pass them off as the ones he wanted. She told the men to clean up the good Holy Mother as well. The dark man smirked and said he already had plenty of beautiful women at home, and that he'd make a lot of money from these too. In a mocking tone, he told the frightened women not to be scared, they'd like it there. Before they could move any closer, a calm but firm voice interrupted them. "Don't be in such a hurry," it said. The leader turned, irritated until he saw who had spoken. It was King Wasvamp himself. The king's expression was cold and commanding. "I forbid you to take these people," he said. The slavers froze, completely stunned to see the ruler standing in front of them, defending the nuns no less. Nervously, the dark man asked what His Majesty was doing there. Ignoring the question, the king stepped closer. "The better question," he said sharply, "is what you are doing here, and why you intend to take these women." The dark man's tone instantly changed. Bowing and smiling, he stammered, "Your Majesty, please forgive us. We have legal grounds." He pulled out a crumpled paper, saying all the holy cathedrals had been given as collateral for a loan. King Wasvamp took the paper and read it carefully. After a moment, he nodded. "It says that—" "Yes," he said, "but these saints belong to the House of Spirits, not the cathedral. Therefore, they are not part of this contract." The man's fake smile twitched. He grew nervous, looking around, and muttered, "If that's the case, then where's the one who is in debt?" His eyes moved from face to face until they landed on the other Holy Mother. "It's her," he said suddenly, pointing at her. When he saw that she was older, his excitement faded into disgust. "Fine," he grunted. "Take her." The woman gasped in shock and tried to protest, but the men grabbed her arms and shoved her into a small wheeled cage. The dark man leaned in with a cruel smirk. "You borrowed money, old woman," he sneered. "Now you'll work it off, whatever it takes." Everyone watched silently as the carriage rolled away, taking the disgraced Holy Mother with it. When it was over, the king turned toward the remaining Holy Mother. He didn't even need to speak. His calm expression made it clear that she had won the contest. The young maiden bowed deeply, tears in her eyes, and thanked him. Later, The group followed King Wasvamp to the spirit haven. The king looked around, clearly impressed. "This place is beautiful," he said softly. "Simple, peaceful. I could stay here for a few days." Meanwhile, Typhon and Universe stood by a half-open door. The young man leaned close and whispered that he had been told to deliver a message. He hesitated, then quietly added that someone was hunting them and they needed to leave soon. The princess laughed, finding his seriousness amusing. Universe, flustered, asked her to keep her voice down, but she just grinned and called out to the Holy Mother behind the door. When the nun appeared, Typhon cheerfully told her that they were leaving, explaining to Universe's horror that they were continuing their honeymoon. The young man's face turned red. The nun smiled knowingly and said she had already guessed they weren't just traveling companions. Typhon laughed and agreed. The dark-haired woman smiled softly and said she wished to connect with the spirits of the spring, just as they had to live in harmony with them, gently and sincerely, with mutual trust. Typhon's expression warmed, and she told her that she was certain she could do it. The girl turned to Universe and asked what he thought. He didn't say a word, just smiled quietly. He could already see that the spirits had accepted her. The princess noticed it too, and understood. The gentle creatures wrapped themselves around the young Holy Mother in a glowing embrace. She stood still, surprised by their warmth, and wondered why her teacher didn't answer while Universe simply smiled, proud of her from the heart. The nun stood by the gate, watching her guests leave in their small carriage. She waved after them with a faint, sad smile, until they disappeared down the road. Two young girls ran up to her, smiling brightly, while the tiny spirits fluttered around them, their wings shimmering in the air. Universe glanced back and gave a soft, reserved smile. He felt happy for the girl. They had finally found real friends, not just companions. She looked truly content. After a while on the road, the carriage stopped for a short rest. Universe stretched and said they were almost at the capital of the kingdom. Beyond that was Kantuare. He reminded Typhon that according to their plan, they had to pass through the capital, but it might be risky. There was a good chance their wanted posters were already hanging everywhere. Since the city was crowded, they'd have to be cautious. The girl grinned and said they could just disguise themselves. And in the blink of an eye, as if by magic, she had already changed her look, wearing a hat, glasses, and a mask. She even mentioned that her ears were covered. Universe frowned. "That outfit looks odd," he said. Typhon blinked, then snapped her fingers and transformed again, this time into a dancer wearing bright, colorful clothes. She twirled and asked teasingly, "Do I look like a dancing girl now?" She defended herself, saying she could hear music from the city ahead. Universe remembered that there was a festival in full swing, one celebrating the heroes of the kingdom. After a moment's thought, he decided they could blend in with the crowd there. Typhon cheered, saying it was time to hit the road again. "Wait," Universe said, trying to slow her down. The girl turned, puzzled, and asked why. He explained that if she danced now, it would draw too much attention. They could easily get caught. She crossed her arms and muttered that he should change his clothes too. "It'll look weird if a dancer's walking next to some guy in a work shirt," she argued. Then, trying to convince him further, she pointed out that if wanted posters showed their faces, people would also recognize their clothes. Universe sighed, realizing she wasn't entirely wrong, but he could tell she just wanted to see him dressed differently. Typhon smiled slyly, clearly amused, and announced she'd pick something for him. He gave in without arguing. Giggling, she dressed him up as a stylish trumpeter, complete with a vest and shiny buttons. Universe looked at himself and frowned. "This is too flashy," he said. "It's fashionable," Typhon said proudly. Then she laid out her grand plan. He'd play the trumpet while she danced. "No one will suspect a thing," she insisted. Before she could start, Universe raised his voice sharply. "Typhon," he said, "don't even think about dancing. We're in the capital of Wasvamp now. There's a huge dance competition going on. It's part of the festival." Typhon's eyes lit up. "Perfect," she said, ignoring him completely. As they entered the city, she let out an excited scream, saying how amazing it felt to be there. Universe could only groan as she started dancing right on top of the moving carriage, spinning and laughing while the crowd gathered around, clapping and cheering. People shouted that she was incredible, the best dancer they'd seen. Meanwhile, Universe tried to keep control of the carriage, but then he spotted the wanted posters. His heart skipped. One of the men nearby noticed the posters too and looked at Universe closely. For a terrifying second, their eyes met. Universe's palms went cold, but then the man smiled and shouted, "Beautiful dancer, keep going." Universe exhaled in relief. He'd almost been caught. Typhon leaned down toward him with a mischievous grin. "Come on, dance with me," she said. "I don't dance," Universe muttered. Then he pointed to the posters around them. "Look, that's us." Typhon squinted and tilted her head. "Really? That doesn't even look like you," she said honestly. "It's like a completely different guy." Universe looked at the poster again, frowning in confusion. "Wait, is that really supposed to be me?" he asked. Typhon glanced at it, tilted her head, and said, "Honestly, you look more like Braban there." Then she crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with determination. "No way I'm letting this slide. I'm tearing them all down." She made a move to jump off the cart, but Universe caught her wrist before she could. "Don't," he said firmly. "If you rip down wanted posters, it's considered a crime. We'll just draw more attention that way." Typhon pouted, then sighed. "Fine, but next time let's stick to the side streets. It's better to stay out of sight than parade right down the main road." "It is not Pange." From out of Conge, Universe chuckled quietly as she climbed back onto the roof again, getting ready to dance. Watching her, he shook his head with a small smile and muttered, "If that's what she wants, I guess we'll do it her way." By the time they reached the city square, the festival was in full swing. Music filled the air, lights sparkled above the crowd, and the host on stage announced the start of the big dance contest held in honor of the heroes. "The best dancers in the kingdom are waiting to show their talent," he shouted. "Anyone brave enough to try come up on stage?" Universe watched with mild amusement as a few performers stepped forward. The host hyped up the first contestant, calling her a very charming young lady and assuring the crowd that she'd already won the visual category. But Universe's smile froze when he realized who the charming young lady was. Typhon. His heart skipped. Oh no. Typhon, standing proudly in the spotlight, began her introduction with full confidence. "I'm not just cute and beautiful," she declared. "I'm also an amazing dancer, and I'm completely sure I'll win this competition." The crowd gasped, then burst into laughter and applause. Even the host was taken aback, but he quickly recovered. "Well, if you're that confident, then you must be very brave," he said. "Now, let's see what you can do. Musicians, get ready." "Musicians?" Typhon repeated blankly. "What musicians?" "The instrumentalists," the host replied, reading from his notes. "Every dancer needs one. You can't dance without music. Each performer must have their own musician with them." He went on to explain that the instrumentalists used cutting-edge electronic devices that were very popular among young people. Typhon's face fell. She slowly stepped down from the stage, looking heartbroken. "Typhon," Universe called softly. She looked back at him with sad eyes. "Universe," she whispered. "What should I do now? They said I can't dance without an instrumentalist." Her voice trembled. "I've always dreamed of dancing for people outside my world. I thought I'd get the chance once I married the hero, but he never let me. And now, when I finally could, I can't." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I just want to dance today, in front of everyone. Can't you think of something?" Universe fell silent, deep in thought. Then it hit him, the spirits of the wind loved to dance. But Typhon, being a princess, had always been held back. He realized how unfair it was that he'd brought her to the city of dance only to stop her from dancing. "Typhon," he said firmly, "I don't care if I can play those fancy instruments or not. I'll do whatever it takes to help you dance. I promise I'll get you back on that stage." Her eyes widened, glowing with joy. She threw her arms around him for a moment, then rushed off to tell the organizers she'd be competing after all. When she came back, she said they'd told her to wait for her turn. Universe nodded. "Got it," he said softly. Typhon looked a little down again, but when he noticed, he smiled at her. "Hey, don't worry. I'll never give up, not for you, and not for the spirits." That made her pause, then smile gently. "You know, your words are nothing like that hero's promises," she said quietly. "You actually mean them. The hero always chased fame he wanted everyone else to sacrifice for him. But you," she looked at him warmly, "you're different. That's why the spirits would choose you instead of him." She giggled, adding, "Besides, you once asked me to dance for you, remember?" She tried to sit down nearby, but suddenly yelped and jumped up. "Ow, what was that?" Universe and Typhon both looked down and saw a strange old gramophone sitting there. Universe knelt beside it and examined it curiously. "This thing's built really well," he said. "Still works, too." He wiped off the dust and read the engraving aloud. "Made in Dudul." As soon as he said it, a soft, echoing voice came from the machine. The two of them froze. "Did you say Doodle?" the voice asked. It was a group of tree spirits living inside the gramophone. Universe blinked, then smiled. "Yeah, I know Doodle. I used to work with sound woodwork, instruments. The spirits gasped in delight. Long ago, people danced to our music, but now they prefer these metal boxes. That gave Universe an idea. Then, how about playing again? For us, the spirits agreed immediately. Of course, we'll play for you. But are you sure you can keep up? The young ones these days might laugh at you. Universe chuckled. Let them. I just want this girl to have her moment. Typhon looked at the gramophone spirits in awe. You're so cute, she said happily. Please dance with me, it'll be fun. After a moment of discussion, the spirits agreed, saying they couldn't refuse such a kind invitation. Just then, one of the stage assistants ran up. Miss Typhon, you're up next, get ready. They carried the gramophone to the stage together. The announcer told the crowd that the competition was reaching its finale. Now, our last performers, the Wind Dancers, he shouted. The audience cheered, but as Universe and Typhon appeared, carrying the old wooden gramophone, people stared in confusion. What's that thing? Someone asked. It's called a gramophone, another replied. My dad had one when he was a kid. Gasps spread through the crowd. That's ancient. She should be using a synthesizer, someone shouted. Typhon grabbed the microphone and cut them off. Enough talking, she said confidently. Just listen. You're about to hear something special. She smiled and added, presenting the legendary DJ Universe. The crowd erupted with laughter and cheers. Universe, standing behind the gramophone, swallowed nervously, but the spirit's soft voices whispered, Don't worry, we've got this. He smiled faintly, looking at Typhon. She turned to him with shining eyes. Thank you, she said softly. This means everything to me. He shook his head and smiled. Don't thank me yet, he said. We're just getting started. Then, with a gentle crackle, the gramophone came to life, ready for their dance.